The morning Eliza Hartwell arrived at the Voss Ranch, Harlan Voss, Colton's uncle, and the man who controlled the family's legal accounts, stood in the middle of the main yard and held up a folded document like it was a death sentence he was proud to deliver. "She gets no deed rights," he announced to no one in particular, loud enough for the three ranch hands leaning against the fence to hear every word. The agreement was for the boy to marry, not for some penniless woman to walk in here and start touching what belongs to this family. Eliza hadn't even stepped off the wagon yet. She sat there with a worn leather bag on her lap, her dark hair pulled back with a strip of cloth, and she listened to Harlan, read the terms of her arrival the way a man reads livestock regulations. No rights to the land, no access to the accounts, no authority over any decision involving the ranch, the cattle, or the workers. "You'll have a room," Harlan said, finally looking up at her, "and you'll have the Voss name. That's more than a woman in your position has any right to expect." The ranch hands laughed, not loudly, just enough. Colton stood 20 feet away and said nothing. If you've ever been told your entire worth could be summed up in a single document, if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in the very place you were supposed to belong, then you already know exactly what Eliza felt in that moment. Question is, what would you have done? If this story is already pulling you in, don't lose it. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. These stories travel farther than we ever expect, and we love knowing exactly how far they've gone. Eliza climbed down from the wagon without help. She didn't look at Harlan when her boots hit the dirt. She didn't look at the ranch hands. She picked up her bag, straightened her coat, and walked toward the main house like she'd already decided something the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. Colton watched her cross the yard. He didn't move to greet her. He told himself it was because there was nothing to say. The marriage had been arranged by their fathers, sealed with paperwork and debt, and sentiment had no place in any of it. He told himself that. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. He didn't know what to say to a woman who walked like that into a place like this and showed no visible fear. The arrangement had started 6 weeks earlier in a lawyer's office in Cheyenne that smelled like old tobacco and financial ruin. Colton's father, Raymond Voss, had spent the better part of a decade making bad decisions with good land. He'd borrowed against the ranch to fund a cattle expansion that never paid off. He'd trusted a bank in Denver that failed. He'd signed contracts with suppliers who underdelivered and still collected full payment because Raymond was too proud to argue in public. By the time Raymond sat across from Eliza's father, Gerald Hartwell, a man who had liquid capital and a daughter he described as capable and unattached, the Voss family was 4 months from losing everything. The deal was simple in the way that humiliating deals always are. Gerald Hartwell would inject enough capital to stabilize the Voss debts and keep the ranch operating for 2 full years. In exchange, his daughter would marry Colton Voss, and the Hartwell name would carry partial standing in whatever future the ranch managed to produce. Colton had not been consulted before the agreement was signed. He found out at dinner when his father poured a second glass of whiskey and explained it the way you explain weather, as something that was simply happening, and resistance was beside the point. "She's not some girl off the street," Raymond had said. "Her father says she knows accounts. She's managed his business records for 3 years. She's a woman. She's money we don't have." Raymond set down his glass. "And she's coming whether you like it or not, so I'd suggest you find a way to make peace with it before she arrives." Colton had made no such peace. He'd spent the 6 weeks between that dinner and Eliza's arrival doing exactly what he always did when something felt out of his control. He worked. He was up before dawn and in bed after dark, and he let the physical exhaustion fill every space where a real feeling might have otherwise taken root. He was good at that. He'd been good at it for years. The first conversation between Colton and Eliza happened that evening, in the kitchen, because she couldn't find the dining room and he was the only one home. She was standing in the doorway with that same leather bag, and she looked at the kitchen table and at him seated at it with a plate of food he hadn't started eating. And she said, "Is there a second plate, or should I find something myself?" He got up and found a second plate. They ate without talking for a while, and the silence was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't yet know what category to put each other in. Then she said, "The document your uncle read to me this afternoon. Is that your position as well, or his?" Colton looked at her. What document? The one outlining what I'm not allowed to do or own or decide. She said it without bitterness, just clinical, like she was reading back a list. I want to know if that reflects your thinking or if it was his performance. He put down his fork. It reflects the family's position. That's not what I asked. He studied her. She was looking at him with an expression that wasn't angry and wasn't soft, it was focused. The way a person looks when they're actually listening and actually expecting an honest answer. I don't know yet, he said, because it was the closest thing to the truth he had. She nodded, like that was acceptable for now. Fair enough. She finished eating. She washed both plates without being asked. And then she went to bed. Colton sat at that table for another 20 minutes, trying to figure out what had just happened. And he couldn't. The ranch itself was in worse shape than Eliza had expected. She'd known it was struggling, that was half the reason for the arrangement. But numbers on paper and the actual physical reality of a failing operation are two different animals. The fencing on the south pasture was rotting in 3 places. The bunkhouse roof had a patch that had been patched too many times. 2 of the wells were drawing slow, which meant either the casing was damaged or the water table had shifted, and either answer was expensive. She didn't say any of this out loud for the first 3 days. She walked the property. She asked quiet questions of the workers who would answer her, mostly a young hand named Pete, who seemed to have no opinion about who she was or wasn't, and just answered what she asked. She sat with the ledger books in the evenings when the house was quiet. By the 4th day, she had a clearer picture than anyone else on the property, and it was not a good picture. The ranch wasn't just struggling, it was bleeding. Slowly, systematically, in ways that had been papered over with short-term solutions for so long that no one could clearly see the original wound anymore. She found Colton on the 4th morning, checking a fence line near the east pasture, and she walked out to him with the ledger open to a specific page and no preamble. "You're losing money on the Tillman supply contract," she said. "They're charging you 12 cents per unit above market rate and have been for at least 2 years. He didn't look at the ledger. "My father negotiated that contract." "I know. It's still costing you." She turned the book toward him. "Here and here. If you renegotiate, cut them entirely, and source through Devers and Laramie, you recover roughly $400 a year. That's not your whole problem, but it's a start." He looked at the page this time. He was quiet for a moment. "Who told you about Devers?" he asked. "No one. I asked Pete what suppliers were in the region, and he listed them. I looked up rates." She closed the book. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to understand what's actually broken, so I can be useful. I didn't ask you to be useful." She looked at him with that same measured expression from the kitchen, not angry, not wounded. "No," she agreed, "but you need it anyway." She walked back toward the house. He stood at that fence line with the morning light coming flat across the pasture, and he thought about calling something after her. Something dismissive, something that would put her back where he'd decided she belonged. But the number she'd cited was accurate, and he knew it was accurate, and he'd known something was wrong with the Tillman contract for over a year without being able to pinpoint it. He didn't call anything after her. Harlan Voss came back to the ranch on the 6th day, and he brought his opinion with him like a man brings mud on his boots everywhere, and unaware of the mess. He found Eliza in the main office, going through a second set of ledgers, the older ones, from before Raymond's expansion, and the sight of her sitting at that desk appeared to cause him genuine physical pain. "Those books are not for you," he said. "These are the records from 1,871 through 1,876, she said, without looking up. "They're not current operations. They're historical. They're Voss family property. Everything here is Voss family property." She finally looked at him. "Including the debts, which your family's capital no longer covers, which is why I'm here. Would you like to continue having this conversation, or would you like me to keep working?" Harlan's face went a particular shade of red that Colton, who had appeared in the doorway behind him, recognized as the color his uncle turned when he was losing an argument he hadn't expected to lose. "Colton," Harlan said, turning. "Get your wife out of that office." Colton looked at Eliza. She'd already gone back to the ledger. She turned a page. "She's working," Colton said. Harlan stared at him. "What?" I said, "She's working. Let her work." He walked away down the hall, and he didn't look back. And he wasn't entirely sure where that had come from, except that something about watching Harlan try to bully a woman over a stack of old accounting records had made his chest go tight in a way he didn't enjoy. Inside the office, Eliza made a small note in the margin of a ledger page and said nothing, but she heard it. The drought started in the 3rd week. It didn't announce itself. Droughts rarely do in Wyoming. They arrive quietly, in the gap between one rain and the next, and you don't realize what's happening until the ground starts to show it. Colton knew. He'd been watching the sky and watching the creek levels, and watching the grass color change from green to a yellowed, tired shade that meant the roots were working harder than they could sustain. He called the hands together and gave the speech he'd given before, during dry seasons conserve water. Move the southern herd closer to the main well. Postpone any non-essential work that required heavy irrigation. Standard procedure. It was what his father had done, and his grandfather before that. Eliza stood at the edge of the group and listened to the whole speech. Afterward, when the men had dispersed, she came to him and said, "The main well is also showing signs of reduced output." He already knew that. "We'll manage." "What's the plan if it goes dry?" "It won't go dry." She didn't push it. She walked back to the house. That evening, she spread a piece of paper across the kitchen table and sketched a rough diagram with a pencil, the layout of the property, the known water sources, the creek path, the geography of the land as she'd walked it in those first few days. Then she started marking locations. Colton came in late and found the diagram. He stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment. "What is this?" "There's a secondary water channel that runs under the northeast corner of the property," she said. She pointed to a mark on the diagram. "The old 1872 records mention it. There was a seasonal well dug there that the previous owners abandoned when they moved the main operation south. I want to ride out there tomorrow and look. That land is rough. I know. Nobody's ridden that corner in probably 8 years. I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm going in the morning. You can come or not." He was quiet for a moment. Why would there still be water there if the original owners abandoned it? Because they moved south for operational convenience, not because the water dried up. The records show it as temporarily closed pending expansion. The expansion went south. Nobody went back. He stared at the diagram. He stared at the mark she'd made in the northeast corner. "Come," he said. It wasn't agreement, exactly. It wasn't trust. But it was something. It was the first time Colton Voss decided to follow his wife's lead rather than dismiss it, and he did it quietly, without ceremony, standing over a hand-drawn map in his own kitchen in the middle of a drought, with the wind picking up outside and the season turning mean. He didn't say anything else. He folded the diagram carefully and set it on the shelf by the door so they wouldn't lose it in the morning. Eliza watched him do that. She didn't say anything either. But she noticed. They rode out before sunrise. Colton had the horses ready by the time Eliza came out of the house with her coat buttoned and the hand-drawn diagram tucked into her inside pocket. She hadn't asked him to prepare her horse. He'd done it anyway, without announcement, the way men on working ranches do things they've decided to do quietly and without ceremony. Pete was the only hand awake at that hour, and he watched them ride northeast with an expression that was mostly confusion and a little curiosity. Nobody went to that corner of the property. The terrain was uneven, cut through with old dry creek beds and scrub growth that made it slow going on horseback. There was no reason to go there. Hadn't been for years. The ride took the better part of an hour, and they covered most of it without talking. That wasn't unusual between them yet. Their silences were still new enough to feel like separate countries, not hostile, just unmapped. Colton rode slightly ahead out of habit, and Eliza led him, because she was watching the land and not particularly interested in leading the way. She was looking at the ground, at the way the grass grew in clusters rather than evenly, at the slight depression in the terrain that suggested subsurface moisture even in a dry season. When they reached the northeast corner, she pulled up her horse and sat there looking at a cluster of scrub cedar and rock formation that had probably looked the same for 30 years. "There," she said. Colton looked at the same cluster of scrub and rock and saw nothing remarkable. "Where?" she pointed. "The cedar's green, not yellowed green. Actually green." In a drought, he looked again. She was right. The trees were dark and healthy, in a way nothing else on this part of the property was. They dismounted and walked the rest of the way on foot. The ground shifted under their boots softer than it should have been given the dry weeks. Eliza crouched down at the base of the rock formation and pressed her palm flat against the earth. "Wet," she said. Colton crouched beside her. The soil was cool and dense with retained moisture. Not wet like a puddle, wet like something underneath was still alive. "There should be a shaft somewhere near here," she said. The 1,872 record described it as hand-dug, about 12 feet deep, lined with stone. They searched for 20 minutes before Colton's boot caught the edge of something solid under a tangle of old cedar root. He pulled back the root with both hands and found a flat stone that didn't belong naturally to the formation. Underneath the stone, a hand-dug shaft, perhaps 3 feet across, stone-lined, partially silted at the top but not collapsed. And at the bottom, visible even in the early morning light, a dark gleam. Water. Colton stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza, who was also staring at it, and there was something on her face he hadn't seen yet, not triumph, nothing that clean. More like the particular relief of a person who'd been carrying a calculation in their head for days and had just had it confirmed. "It'll need to be cleared and fitted with a proper casing," she said. "Maybe 2 weeks of work, but it's here." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything complimentary. He didn't say anything at all for a moment, and then what he said was, "We'll need to bring Pete and 2 others out here tomorrow," which was, coming from Colton Voss, practically a standing ovation. The work on the northeast well started. 4 days later, after Colton spent a day and a half wrestling with whether he was going to commit that labor and materials to a project his uncle hadn't sanctioned and the ranch hands hadn't asked for. He made the decision the way he made most decisions alone, without consultation, and once made, without revisiting it. Harlan found out on the 3rd day and drove out to the site in a fury. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his hands on his hips, watching Pete and 2 other men working the shaft, and his first words were directed at Colton, not at Eliza, because Harlan operated on the principle that the woman was a problem that Colton needed to solve. "Whose idea was this?" "Mine," Colton said. That was technically a lie, and Eliza, who was standing 6 feet away reviewing a supply ledger, knew it was a lie, and Colton knew that she knew. But he said it anyway, flatly, with the ease of a man covering ground he'd already decided to cover. Harlan looked at Eliza and then back at Colton. "You're pulling 4 men off rotation during drought season to dig a well that may or may not produce anything usable. It'll produce. On what basis? On the basis that there's already water in it." Harlan went quiet. That was the thing about Harlan Voss, he wasn't stupid, and he was harder to argue with when the facts were plainly against him. He turned and looked at the shaft, where Pete had come up for a break and was drinking from a canteen with his boots caked in dark, moist soil that told its own story. "This was her idea," Harlan said. Not a question. Colton said nothing. "I'm telling you, Colton, that woman is going to rearrange this ranch until you don't recognize it, and by the time you figure out you should have stopped her, it'll be too late to undo." "She found water on our land during a drought," Colton said. "I'm going to go ahead and let that stand." Harlan left without another word. His horse kicked up dust going back toward the main road, and nobody watched him go except Pete, who took another drink from his canteen and then climbed back into the shaft. That evening, when the workers had returned to the bunkhouse and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet of a place exhausted by its own daily effort, Eliza found Colton at the fence behind the main barn doing nothing in particular, just standing there the way men sometimes do when they're thinking something they haven't put into words yet. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Tell him it was your idea. It was easier. Maybe." She leaned against the fence beside him. Not close, but not at a distance meant to signal anything. "He's not going to stop." "No," Colton agreed. "He's not." "Is he dangerous?" Colton thought about that. "Not the way you mean. He doesn't hit people. He works through paperwork and legal pressure and the social machinery of who's whom. That's the way the Voss family has always solved problems. And does he have legal standing to interfere? He holds power of attorney over some of the older accounts. My father signed it over to him during the bad years, when Raymond was too overwhelmed to manage it himself." He paused, "which means he has more control over this ranch's finances than anyone besides me probably realizes." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "How much more control?" Colton looked at her. Enough that if he decides he wants to make trouble, he can. She nodded. She didn't look alarmed, which was either good judgment or a kind of composure that ran deeper than he'd given her credit for. She pushed off the fence and started back toward the house. "Then we need to move faster," she said over her shoulder. He turned to watch her go. He was beginning to notice that she always seemed to be a step ahead of whatever conversation they were having. Not because she talked faster, but because she thought through implications, while other people were still processing the immediate problem. It was a quality that could be genuinely useful. It was also, he acknowledged privately, a quality that made him feel several steps behind in a place he'd spent his entire life. The well came in full production on a Thursday, and by Friday morning the word had spread through the ranch hands, the way good news always spreads on a struggling property carefully. Like people who've been disappointed too many times, aren't quite willing to let themselves believe it yet. But the water was real. Clean, consistent, properly cased now with fresh timber and fitted with a hand pump that Pete had assembled himself using parts from a broken windmill in the south barn. The northeast corner of the Voss Ranch had a working water source that could sustain the cattle in that pasture through the rest of the dry season without drawing anything from the main well. It wasn't a solution to all their problems. Eliza knew that and made sure not to present it as one. But it changed the immediate calculus of the drought in a way that let the ranch breathe just slightly, just enough. What she hadn't anticipated was what the well would do to the workers' perception of her. It happened gradually, over about a week, in the way that perceptions on a working ranch change not through speeches or confrontations, but through the accumulation of small observations. Pete talked, not excessively, but he mentioned to the other hands that the new well had been found because Mrs. Voss read something in an old ledger and then rode out to check it. One of the older hands, a man named Garrison, who'd been with the Voss Ranch for 11 years, and had the deeply ingrained skepticism of someone who'd outlasted multiple disasters, started paying attention in a way he hadn't before. Garrison was the first one to come to Eliza directly. He found her in the main office on a Tuesday, working through supply invoices, and he knocked on the door frame the way men knock when they're uncertain of their welcome. "Got a question," he said. She looked up. "Come in." He stood just inside the door, hat in his hands, not out of formal respect, but out of the working habit of men who handle their hats when they're uncertain. "The South pasture feed situation. We've been buying cut hay from Tillman going on 3 years. Is it true you're looking to change that?" She put down her pen. "Where'd you hear that?" "Harlan. He told the men you were planning to cut Tillman, and it'd cost us our supply line." She thought for a moment. "What I told Colton was that we're overpaying Tillman by a significant margin, and there are alternatives. I haven't cut anyone. I've made a recommendation." Garrison nodded slowly. "The men are worried." "About what specifically?" "Changes get made, and then they don't work, and everything gets worse. That's happened here before." He said it without accusation, just flatly, as a man who'd lived it. "I know," she said. "That's why I haven't moved quickly." He looked at her, a long, evaluating look that had nothing performative in it, just genuine assessment. "You know what's actually wrong with this place? Tell me what you think." He seemed mildly surprised that she'd asked it that way. He pulled the door mostly shut and sat down in the chair across from her desk, still holding his hat, and for the next 40 minutes he told her things about the operational failures of the Voss Ranch that weren't anywhere in the ledger books, the supplier relationships that had soured, the grazing decisions that had damaged the North pasture years ago and never been properly remediated, the fact that the bunkhouse roof situation was worse than it looked from outside because 2 of the support beams were rotting from moisture that had been getting in for at least 3 seasons. She listened. She took notes. She asked occasional questions that were specific and operational, not theoretical, and Garrison answered them all. When he stood to leave, he said, "I don't know what you're planning, but you ask the right questions." That was it. No pledge of loyalty, no dramatic declaration. He put his hat on and walked out, but he didn't leave the ranch. Not then, not in the months that followed. Colton found out about the conversation with Garrison, the same way he found out about most things happening on his own property that week. After the fact, from Pete, who mentioned it in passing while they were working a fence repair in the late afternoon. "Garrison spent near an hour in the office with your wife yesterday," Pete said, pulling wire taut. Colton held the post steady. "Doing what?" Talking seemed like. She had a paper out and was writing things down. Colton was quiet for a stretch. Garrison doesn't talk to people he doesn't trust. No, Pete agreed. He doesn't. Another length of silence, the kind that happens between men doing physical work when neither of them is sure what the other is thinking. She asked you to fix that pump on the northeast well yourself, Colton said. She asked if I could. I said yes. You could have asked me for the parts. She already had the inventory list, Pete said. Knew exactly what was in the south barn. Told me where to find the casing hardware. He paused. She'd already walked the barn. Colton absorbed that. He hadn't walked the south barn in a while. He'd known in a general way what was in it, the way you know what's in a room you used to spend time in, but she'd cataloged it. Quietly, without any announcement, she'd cataloged the whole thing. She walked every building on this property. In the first 2 weeks, Pete said. I saw her out there with a notebook. Didn't say nothing because it didn't seem like my business. Colton finished the fence section and stood back to look at the line. It was straight. Good work. The kind of work that doesn't get noticed when it's done right. He thought about Eliza moving through the south barn with a notebook. He thought about her at that kitchen table with the hand-drawn map. He thought about the way she'd stood in the main yard on the day she arrived with Harlan, reading a document at her like a verdict, and how she hadn't flinched, not once, not even slightly. He thought she'd been working from the first hour, and he'd been standing 20 feet away doing nothing. 3 weeks into the drought, a man named Decker Crane showed up at the main gate. Crane was the ranch manager for Aldous Briggs, and if Harlan Voss was a complication, Aldous Briggs was something categorically different. Briggs owned the largest consolidated landholding in the county, built over 20 years through a combination of strategic purchase, aggressive debt collection, and a legal team in Cheyenne that had made several smaller ranchers' problems disappear in ways that technically remained within the boundaries of the law. Briggs had been interested in the Voss land for years. Not openly, that wasn't his style. But the interest was known among people who paid attention to such things, which Eliza had been doing since before she arrived. Crane came to the door of the main house and asked for Colton. Colton was out on the south pasture, and Eliza answered the door. Ma'am, Crane said, touching his hat. He was a lean man with careful eyes that took inventory of a room before he said anything. I'm looking for Colton Voss. He's working. I'm his wife. What's your business? A slight pause, the micro-hesitation of a man recalculating. Mr. Briggs is interested in discussing some mutual opportunities with your husband. What kind of opportunities? I'm not at liberty to go into detail with. He stopped. With me, she finished. He had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable. I'd prefer to speak with Mr. Voss directly. He'll be available after 5. You're welcome to wait in the yard. She said it pleasantly, without edge, and closed the door. She went immediately to find Colton. She didn't run, because running communicates panic, and panic communicates weakness. And Eliza Hartwell had learned very young that how you move through a space tells everyone in it something about what kind of person you are. She walked quickly, with purpose, and she found Colton at the edge of the south pasture and said, Aldous Briggs sent someone to the house. His ranch manager. He wants to talk about opportunities. Colton's jaw went tight. Crane, lean man, careful eyes. That's Crane. He pulled off his work gloves and looked toward the main house. Briggs doesn't send Crane unless he's serious about something. I know, I left him waiting in the yard. She met his eyes. Don't go into that conversation without knowing what he wants and why he wants it now. A man like Briggs doesn't make casual inquiries during a drought on a struggling property unless he thinks the timing is right. I know how Briggs operates. Then you know this isn't a social visit. He looked at her for a moment. There was something shifting in his expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of both a recalibration, the kind that happens when someone keeps proving there's something you didn't account for. You come with me, he said. She'd been hoping he'd say that. She didn't show it. All right. They walked back to the main house together, and Crane was still waiting in the yard exactly where she'd left him, standing at a studied ease that was not actually ease at all. He saw them coming, and his careful eyes registered Eliza's presence beside Colton and processed whatever conclusion that led him to without showing it. Crane, Colton said, Mr. Voss, a nod toward Eliza. Ma'ams, my wife stays. Colton said, whatever you have to say, say it. Crane didn't object. He delivered Briggs' message with the smooth economy of a man who'd relayed other men's propositions many times. Briggs was interested in purchasing the northeast quarter of the Voss property, land Colton hadn't been actively using, at a price he described as fair and well above assessed value. The drought, Crane implied, without quite saying it, made this a timely opportunity to reduce the carrying burden of land that wasn't currently producing. Colton listened with his arms crossed and his face closed. Eliza listened without showing anything at all. "Tell Mr. Briggs thank you for his interest," Colton said when Crane finished. "The northeast quarter isn't available." Crane nodded. He'd expected this. "If your position changes, it won't." After Crane left, Colton turned to Eliza and said, with the flat certainty of someone naming a thing they've known for a while, "He knows about the well." She thought so too, which means someone told him. Neither of them said Harlan's name. They didn't need to. The days that followed had a different quality, sharper, the way air goes before a storm shifts it. Eliza began working with a speed she hadn't shown in the first weeks, partly because the immediate crisis of the drought was stabilizing, and she could move from pure triage to something more structural, and partly because Briggs' approach through Crane had confirmed a timeline she'd suspected existed. A man like that didn't send his manager to make a polite offer. He sent his manager to take a measurement to see how desperate the target was, how close to the edge. The offer itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what came after the offer was refused. She started with the Tillman contract. She drafted the alternative arrangement with Devers in Laramie and brought it to Colton with the numbers laid out plainly, and this time he looked at it properly, asked 3 specific questions, and signed the new agreement without requiring a second conversation. Then she did something that no one on the property expected. She called a meeting with the hands, not Colton's meeting, hers. She asked Pete to tell everyone that she'd like to gather in the main barn after the evening work was done, and she was there first, standing at the center of the barn floor with a lantern and no notes, and the men came in ones and twos with the wariness of people who'd been to enough ranch meetings to know they usually ended with someone losing something. Garrison sat in the front, Pete beside him. 7 other men ranged behind them. She didn't apologize for calling the meeting. She didn't ease into it with pleasantries. "The ranch has a problem that's bigger than the drought," she said. "You all know that. You've known it longer than I have. What I want to tell you is that I'm working on a plan to fix it, not just stabilize it, not just survive this season, but actually fix it. And I need to know what you need to do your work properly. Not what the ledgers say you have. What you actually need." Silence. The particular silence of men who'd never been asked that question by anyone with authority over the supply budget. Then one of the older hands, a man named Curran who Eliza had barely spoken to, said, "The bunkhouse roof. I know about the roof. It'll be fixed before fall. What else?" And it opened. Not dramatically, there was no dramatic moment where everything shifted. But slowly, in the way that things open when people cautiously decide to test whether a door actually moves, the men told her things. Equipment that needed replacing. A fence situation in the northwest section nobody had reported because the last time someone reported an infrastructure problem, it resulted in budget cuts rather than repairs. A grazing rotation issue in the east pasture that Garrison had been managing around rather than through because he didn't have the extra labor to do it right. She wrote all of it down. In the lantern light, in the main barn, with 7 ranch hands and Garrison and Pete watching, she wrote every problem down, and then she said, "I can't fix everything at once, but I'll tell you what's getting done and when, and I won't lie to you about the timeline." After the meeting, Garrison came to her as the men were filing out and said, low enough that only she could hear it, "They'll work for you now. I'm not trying to take anything from Colton. I know that," he said, "but they'll work for you." Colton had stood at the back of the barn for most of the meeting. He'd come in quietly, 5 minutes after it started, and stayed near the doorway where the lantern light didn't quite reach, and he heard everything. He watched his men who'd been close-mouthed and defensive, for months open up to a woman they'd mocked when she stepped off a wagon 3 weeks ago. He didn't say anything that night, but something had settled in him. Not resolved, he wasn't a man who resolved things quickly, and his feelings about Eliza were still complicated by pride and the residual difficulty of having been handed a situation he hadn't chosen. But something had settled. He'd been running this ranch since his father's health failed. He'd been holding it together through sheer stubbornness and familiar routine. And he'd been failing at it slowly, by inches, in ways he could feel but couldn't seem to stop. She'd been here less than a month and had found water, renegotiated a supply contract, cataloged every building on the property, won over Garrison, and run a meeting that got more honest information out of his workers than he'd been able to get in a year. He wasn't sure what to do with that. What he did that night, after the barn had emptied and the lanterns were out, and Eliza was back at the house, going through the notes from the meeting, was go to his father's old chair on the porch and sit there for a long time, watching the dark. He wasn't angry. He'd thought maybe he would be. Some men got angry when they felt shown up. But he wasn't angry. He was something more uncomfortable than angry. He was grateful, and he didn't quite know what to do with that yet. The letter from Harlan arrived on a Wednesday morning, and it was formal enough that Eliza understood immediately it had been written with legal advice behind it. It was addressed to Colton. It outlined, in careful language, Harlan's concern that the management decisions being made at the Voss Ranch were outside the scope of competence of the current household, and that as holder of power of attorney over the legacy accounts, he was formally requesting a review of all expenditure decisions made in the past 30 days. Colton read it twice standing at the kitchen table. He set it down. Eliza, who had read it over his shoulder, they'd reached the point where she read his correspondence without asking, and he'd stopped minding, said, "He's building a paper record. Yes, he wants to be able to show, if it comes to it, that he objected early." Yes. Colton picked up the letter and looked at it again. He can request a review. That's within his rights under the power of attorney structure. What that means practically is that someone, likely a lawyer from Shan, comes out here and looks at the books. Then the books need to look right, Eliza said. They do look right. You've been keeping them. I know. But we need to look further ahead than Harlan's next move. She pulled out the chair across from and sat down. The power of attorney your father signed over to Harlan, is it irrevocable? Colton frowned. I don't know the exact terms. I'd need to look at the original document. Where is it? Filing cabinet in the office. Third drawer. She went and found it. 15 minutes later, she's back at the kitchen table with the document and a look on her face that was focused rather than worried, which was different from how Colton himself felt. It's not irrevocable, she said. It can be revoked by your father, or if your father is incapacitated by you, as the primary heir and operational head of the ranch, with 30 days written notice to the holder. Colton stared at her. My father's not incapacitated. He's just absent and unable to manage his affairs, which legally is not far from the same thing depending on the language of the document. She pushed the papers toward him. You should talk to a lawyer, not Harlan's lawyer. Your own. He sat back. He looked at the document. He looked at Eliza. You read legal agreements, he said. Came out sounding almost like an accusation, but it wasn't. It was more like someone encountering a room in a house they thought they knew and finding it larger than they'd expected. My father was a businessman, she said. He didn't have sons. He taught me what he knew. Colton was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you lead with that? When you first arrived, she looked at him steadily. Because I was being read a list of things I wasn't allowed to do before I'd even taken off my coat, she said. And I didn't know yet whether you were the kind of person who could hear it. He absorbed that. It landed harder than he expected. And now, he said. She considered him for a moment, the same measured, direct evaluation that had characterized every honest exchange they'd had since the beginning. I think you're the kind of person who can hear most things, she said, when you're ready. He picked up the document. He read it properly this time, following her notations in the margin. And the whole time he read it, he was aware that she was watching him and not making it feel like surveillance, watching the way a person watches when they actually care what you're going to do next. I'll write to a lawyer in Laramie, he said. Not Cheyenne. Good. This is going to make Harlan worse. I know. And Briggs is still watching. I know that too. She folded her hands on the table. But if Harlan loses the power of attorney, Briggs loses his inside access. And without inside access, all he can do is come at us from the outside, which is easier to see coming. Exactly. Outside, the wind was picking up again. The drought wasn't over, it still had weeks left in it, probably, and the ranch still had a dozen problems that didn't have clean solutions. But sitting in that kitchen with the late morning light coming through the single window and the legal document laid flat between them, Colton felt something he hadn't felt about this place in a long time. Not comfort, not ease. Something more like fight. Like the specific quality of determination that only shows up when you've been backed into a corner and you finally decide the corner is where you stop moving backward. He folded the document carefully and stood. I need to write that letter. I know. He walked to the office. He sat at the desk. He uncapped the pen, and for the first time since his father had signed the wrong paper during the wrong season and handed a piece of this family away, Colton Voss began the process of taking it back. The letter to the lawyer in Laramie went out on a Thursday, and by Friday Harlan knew about it. Colton hadn't told him. Eliza hadn't told him. The only person who'd been in the office when the letter was written and sealed was Pete, who'd carried it to town, and Pete wasn't the kind of man who talked to Harlan about anything voluntarily. But Harlan had a way of knowing things on this property that predated Eliza's arrival and had nothing to do with anyone being deliberately disloyal. It was more that he'd spent years cultivating the small-souled debts that a man accumulates when he controls access to money, and some of those debts were still being quietly serviced. He arrived at the ranch on Saturday morning with a different energy than his previous visits. Less performance, more pressure. He didn't stand in the yard reading documents this time. He came directly to the house and knocked on the door, and when Colton opened it, Harlan walked in without being invited. "You're contacting Merritt in Laramie," he said. It wasn't a question. Colton stepped back from the door. "I'm getting legal counsel. That's my right. You're trying to revoke your father's power of attorney. I'm looking at my options." Harlan's voice dropped, which was somehow worse than when it was loud. "Colton, your father signed that over to me during the worst period this ranch has ever had. I kept this place from going under while your father was too sick to stand up straight. I held the accounts together. And now you're going to take that away, because your wife has been in those books for a month." Colton looked at him. "She found problems you didn't find, Harlan. Found a well. She found a well. She renegotiated our supply contract. She identified 4 years of overbilling, and she's brought the hands back into this operation in a way they haven't been in years." He said it without heat. "That's not nothing. And when she makes a decision that costs this ranch everything, who answers for it? You? She's not a rancher, Colton. She's a bookkeeper from a small operation who reads some ledgers and thinks that makes her qualified to run. She's my wife," Colton said it quietly, "and she's doing the work. So we're done talking about her qualifications." Harlan shifted tactics the way experienced arguers do, not visibly retreating, just finding a different angle. "What does your father think about all of this?" "I'll be going to see him next week. He hasn't responded to my last 2 letters. He's not well." "Exactly." Harlan pointed at him. "He is not well, and someone is making significant operational decisions on this ranch without his knowledge. And if he comes back to find everything rearranged by someone who had no standing here 6 weeks ago." "Someone who had no standing," Colton repeated. "You mean my wife?" Harlan stopped. "I want you off this property by noon," Colton said. "I'll speak to Merritt, and I'll inform you of whatever decisions I make. That's all I owe you." Harlan left. He didn't slam the doormen who operated through legal machinery rarely slammed doors, because doors were physical and obvious, and they preferred instruments that weren't. But he left with the particular controlled fury of a person who has just been told that the game they've been playing is changing, and they haven't yet figured out how to change with it. Eliza came into the hallway from the office, where she'd heard the whole exchange. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood there with a pen still in her hand and looked at Colton. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine, he's going to do something," she said. "He came here to measure how far you'd push back, and now he knows. He'll recalibrate." "I know. I know, Eliza." He wasn't sharp with her. "Just tired. Give me an hour." She nodded and went back to the office. He went to the porch and stood there for a while with the morning around him and thought about his father, the real version of his father, not the image Harlan kept invoking as a kind of moral authority. Raymond Voss had been a man of large appetites and real warmth and profoundly bad judgment in matters of money, and he'd loved this land more than he'd known how to manage it. The power of attorney he'd signed over to Harlan hadn't been malicious. It had been desperate, and desperation had its own logic. But the result of that desperation was that Harlan had spent 3 years with his hand in the machinery of this ranch. And now extracting that hand cleanly was going to cost something. Colton just didn't know yet what it was going to cost. The response from Merritt in Laramie came faster than expected 8 days, which suggested the lawyer had either cleared his calendar or recognized the situation as the kind that moved quickly, whether you were ready or not. His letter confirmed what Eliza had read in the document. The power of attorney was revocable. The process required 30 days formal notice delivered in person or by registered courier to the holder. If Harlan contested the revocation, it would require a hearing, which meant time and expense. But Merritt's professional opinion was that the case for revocation was solid, given that Colton was functional, present, and the primary heir in active management of the property. There was one complication. Merritt flagged a secondary clause that Eliza had noted but not yet fully parsed, a provision that allowed Harlan to petition for an emergency accounting review if he could demonstrate that the ranch's financial decisions were creating material risk to the secured debts still on the property. This wasn't standard language, and Merritt suspected it had been inserted during a revision that Raymond hadn't read carefully, but it existed and it was valid. If Harlan filed that petition, Merritt wrote, it would freeze discretionary spending on the ranch for up to 60 days pending review. 60 days. In the middle of everything they were trying to build. Eliza read that paragraph twice, set the letter on the desk, and said nothing for a full minute. Colton, reading it beside her, said, "Can he win that petition?" "Not if the books are clean." "They are clean, I know." She tapped the clause with one finger. "But clean books take time to verify. 60 days of frozen discretionary spending means no new equipment, no hired labor, no new supplier agreements, no infrastructure repair. It means everything we've started stops." Colton looked at the letter. "So what do we do?" "We move everything we're planning to move before he files." She looked at him. "He hasn't filed yet. This is still a threat, not an action. Which means we have a window." "How long?" "I don't know. Weeks. Maybe less." She stood. "I need to reprioritize everything." What followed was the most concentrated 2 weeks of work the Voss Ranch had seen in years. Eliza pushed through 4 infrastructure repairs. She'd been planning to stagger over 2 months the bunkhouse roof, the northwest fence section, the south barn's drainage situation, and the east pasture grazing rotation that Garrison had been managing around, rather than through. She accelerated the new supply agreement with Devers from provisional to fully contracted. She got Colton to sign off on 2 new pieces of equipment, a replacement pump for the main well and a hay cutter that would reduce their dependence on outside purchased feed. She did all of it inside the existing budget, which required a level of accounting precision that left her up past midnight more than once, cross-referencing invoices and projections, with the focus of someone diffusing something that would go off if she miscalculated. Colton helped. Not by running numbers, that was her territory, and they'd both implicitly recognized that, but by doing the physical management that freed up the hands she needed on the repair projects. He worked the south pasture himself, pushed through a fence job that had been sitting undone for weeks, managed the cattle rotation single-handedly 2 days running, so that Garrison and Pete could focus elsewhere. They didn't talk much during those 2 weeks. Not because anything was wrong between them. It was the opposite, actually. They'd reached a kind of working shorthand that didn't require much conversation, the way people develop when they're in a genuine emergency together, and the emergency is clarifying rather than divisive. One evening near the end of the second week, Eliza came to the kitchen for water, long after the house was dark, and found Colton sitting at the table with a lamp and a cold cup of coffee, going over a grazing map. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." She filled a cup and sat down across from him, not to work, just to sit. He looked at her, really looked, the kind of looking that isn't assessment, but something less defended. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When you agreed to this, the arrangement, the marriage, what did you actually think you were coming to?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding how much of it to say. "I knew the ranch was struggling. My father told me what the financial situation was. He told me the Voss land was good land, and the debt was manageable if someone actually managed it." She turned the cup in her hands. "I thought there would be a longer adjustment period before anyone took me seriously. I thought I'd spend 6 months being ignored before I earned enough standing to do anything real. But Harlan moved faster. Harlan moved faster." She paused. And you moved faster than I expected too. He looked at her. Meaning what? Meaning you let me work sooner than I thought you would. She said it simply, without flattery, just as a fact. That day at the northeast corner. You came. You didn't have to. He looked down at the grazing map. I should have come sooner. You came when you were ready. She was quiet a moment. That's honest, at least. He looked up at her, then, and there was something between them in the lamplight that wasn't yet named, and neither of them was in a position to name, but it was real, and they both knew it was real, and that was probably enough for now. Some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be long. She did. Harlan filed the emergency accounting petition on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his last visit to the ranch. Merritt sent word by fast courier the petition had been filed in Cheyenne, and the mandatory review period would begin in 5 business days, unless Colton filed a counter response challenging the basis of the petition. Eliza read the courier's note and sat very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she said, "He filed it before we completed the equipment contracts." Colton looked at the timing. By 4 days. The pump and the hay cutter aren't signed yet. No, she pressed her lips together. Those are the 2 biggest items. If the review freezes discretionary spending before we close those contracts, we lose them both. Devers will honor the supply agreement that's fully executed. The equipment dealers won't hold those prices under a 60-day review. Can we sign them before the 5 days are up? The pump, yes. The hay cutter, the dealer is in Casper. Someone needs to ride to Casper and close that agreement in person within 4 days. Colton was already reaching for his coat. I'll go in the morning. 2 days ride. Then I'll ride fast. He paused. Can you manage here if I'm gone 4 days? She looked at him. Colton, go, he went. He left before 5 the next morning on his best horse with enough supplies for the road and the particular focused grimness of a man who's tired of having things taken from him. He pushed the horse hard but not recklessly, and he made it to Casper in a day and a half on the second morning of hard riding. The equipment dealer, a man named Hobart who ran a legitimate operation out of a large warehouse on the south edge of town, received Colton in his office with the practiced ease of a businessman who'd seen frontier ranchers. Arrive in a hurry before and knew what it usually meant. Colton signed the hay cutter agreement. He got Hobart to stamp the contract with that day's date, the 3rd day of the 5-day window. On the ride back, he thought about Eliza. He thought about her sitting in that office, going through the books, managing Garrison and Pete and the hands, keeping everything running while he was 2 days away. He thought about what Harlan had said. She's a bookkeeper from a small operation who read some ledgers, and he thought about how wrong that was. Not in an abstract way, but in the specific way that you recognize wrongness when you've watched someone do the actual work. She wasn't a bookkeeper. She was something the frontier didn't have a good word for yet. A person who could look at a broken system and see exactly where to put her hands. He got back to the ranch on the evening of the 4th day, tired and trail-worn and, though he wouldn't have used the word himself, relieved in a way that had less to do with the contract and more to do with the sight of the lamplight in the main house window. Eliza came to the door when she heard the horse. She looked at him at the dust and the road tiredness and the fact that he was back and said, "Did you get it?" "I got it," she exhaled. "Just once. Quick, the kind of exhale that shows you've been holding something." "Good." Merritt's counter-response goes out tomorrow morning, with the signed contracts attached. He put the horse up and came inside, and she had food on the table, which he ate standing, because he was too tired to sit gracefully, and she sat across from him and updated him on the 4 days what the hands had completed. A minor fence issue in the north section that Garrison had handled, a visit from a neighboring rancher named Alderman, who'd come to ask about the Devers' supply arrangement, because he'd heard the Voss Ranch had found better terms. "What did you tell Alderman?" Colton asked. "I told him I'd have you contact him when you were back." She paused. "He mentioned that 2 other ranches in the county are having supply problems similar to ours. Same overbilling patterns." Colton looked at her. "Briggs." "Briggs," she confirmed. "Or people connected to him. The same supplier network. I've been looking at it for 2 weeks, and I think there's a coordinated pattern, not just opportunism, but deliberate margin manipulation across multiple operations to create financial pressure. To force sales. To force sales," she said it carefully. "If Briggs can apply enough financial pressure to 3 or 4 ranches simultaneously, he creates a distress environment. Then he comes in with purchase offers that look generous against a backdrop of apparent crisis. Colton put down his fork. How many ranches are we talking about? That I can document, 3 including us. She met his eyes. There may be more. He was quiet for a moment. The exhaustion of the road sat on him, but underneath it something else was gathering, a cold, specific anger of the kind that doesn't make noise but doesn't leave either. You should talk to Alderman, she said. I will. And we should find out if the other ranches have the same documentation. Eliza, he said it quietly, and when she looked at him, he said, This is bigger than a property dispute now. Yes, she said, it is. He met with Alderman the following week, on the Alderman Ranch about 6 miles north. Nathaniel Alderman was a man in his late 50s who'd run his property for 30 years with the stubborn competence of someone who'd survived enough bad seasons to trust only what he could see with his own eyes. He was skeptical of Colton by default and of Eliza by additional default. But he was also smart enough to know that the supply situation on his ranch had been wrong for longer than he could explain, and he'd run out of other explanations. Eliza came with Colton, Alderman's wife, a quiet woman named Helen, who turned out to be very much not quiet once she had something to say, met them at the door. And there was a brief moment where Alderman looked at Eliza with a particular expression of a man who wasn't sure whether to be affronted or curious that a woman had been brought to a business meeting on his property. Helen Alderman resolved this by sitting down at the table and saying, Let's hear what she found. Alderman sat. Eliza laid out the documentation she'd assembled her own ranch's supply invoices against market rates, the timeline of discrepancies, and the pattern she'd identified when she cross-referenced the supplier names against what Alderman had mentioned in passing to Colton. She didn't editorialize. She put the numbers in front of him and let him look. Alderman looked for a long time. This is the Tisselson network, he said finally. Not Tillman, a different supplier, but the same pattern. Connected to Tillman? Eliza asked. Connected to a man named Crane, he said. Then he looked up sharply. You know that name. Briggs Ranch Manager, Colton said. Same man. Alderman put the papers down. I always thought the pricing was just inflation. Frontier rates, bad season, whatever excuse they gave. I didn't sit down and document it because he stopped. Because you were too busy keeping the ranch running to audit your own suppliers, Eliza said. Not as an accusation, just as a fact he didn't need to be ashamed of. He looked at her differently after that. What do you want from me? I want to know if there are other ranches have the same problem, she said. And I want to know if any of them have documentation. Alderman was quiet. He looked at Helen. Helen looked at him with the expression of a woman who'd been waiting for someone to do exactly this for longer than was comfortable. Ferris and Brandt, Alderman said. East County. Both of them have been bleeding for 2 years. Ferris almost sold last spring. Briggs made him an offer. Did he take it? No, but it was close. He picked up one of Eliza's pages and looked at it again. If you could show that the financial pressure was manufactured, that Briggs or his people were systematically manipulating supplier costs to engineer distress. That's what I'm trying to show, she said. That's not a civil matter, Alderman said. That's fraud. Yes, Eliza said, it is. The table was quiet. Through the window, the afternoon light was going amber across the north pasture, and somewhere outside a horse was complaining about something in the way horses do when they're bored and tied up too long. And the sound of it was ordinary, and the moment around the table was not. I'll contact Ferris and Brandt, Alderman said finally. And there's a man named Yates on the South Ridge who sold his place 3 years ago for less than half what it was worth. I always thought that was wrong. He set the paper down. If Yates still has his old invoices, tell him to keep them safe, Eliza said. Alderman nodded. He looked at Colton. Your wife put this together? She put it together, Colton said. Alderman nodded again, slower this time, the nod of a man recategorizing something in his mental accounting. You should have said you were bringing someone useful, he said, not to Eliza, to Colton, because he still operated that way. But it was the closest he was going to get to a compliment, and everybody in the room knew it. Helen refilled the coffee without being asked. The Cheyenne Review came in the 5th week. 2 men, an auditor named Settle and a clerk whose name nobody caught, arrived at the ranch with the combination of bureaucratic authority and mild personal discomfort that characterized men who'd been sent somewhere they weren't particularly wanted. Settle was competent and thorough and not unkind, and he went through the Voss books with the systematic focus of a man who'd done this many times and knew what he was looking for. Harlan had sent him here, expecting to find disorder. What he found instead was Eliza's bookkeeping. It took Settle a day and a half to complete his review. At the end of it, he sat at the main office desk, looked at the books spread before him, and said to Colton, "These accounts are the cleanest operation I've reviewed in 4 years. Whoever is keeping these books knows what they're doing." Colton didn't look at Eliza, who was standing in the doorway, but he wanted to. "The discretionary spending freeze will be lifted," Settle said. "I'll have my recommendation in Cheyenne by the end of the week." There was no material risk. The petition was. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who didn't want to editorialize on paper. The petition appears to have been premature. After Settle left, Eliza leaned against the office doorframe and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Harlan is going to know the petition failed before his lawyer gets the formal notification." "Yes, and Briggs will know too. Probably. Which means whatever they plan to do next, they'll do it soon." She looked at him. "They're not going to stop, Colton. We've beaten every legal and procedural move they've had. What's left is something less procedural." He looked at her. "You think they'll come at the land directly?" "I think a man like Briggs, when he runs out of leverage, uses pressure he doesn't have to explain in a courtroom." She said it steadily without fear, but her hands were folded tight in her lap. "I think we need to be ready for that," he said. "What does ready look like?" She unfolded her hands and stood up straight. "It looks like what we've already been doing. Except we need more people doing it with us." She'd been laying the groundwork for this, without exactly naming it: the meetings with aldermen, the contact with Ferris and Brandt through Alderman's introduction, the slow accumulation of documentation that was becoming something more than one ranch's grievance. It was becoming a picture, a coherent, damning picture of systematic manipulation by a man who'd operated for years under the assumption that frontier ranchers were too isolated and too proud and too busy surviving to ever compare notes. Eliza had been comparing notes, and now she needed to show them to the right people. The meeting happened at the Alderman Ranch because it was the most central, and because Alderman had been the first to come in, and there was a symbolic logic to gathering at the place where the alliance had started. It wasn't a large gathering. 5 ranches represented Voss: Alderman, Ferris, Brandt, and a man named Caleb Yates, who'd sold his place 3 years ago, but still lived in the county and had, as Alderman had hoped, kept his invoices in a box under his bed, out of the specific stubbornness of a man who knew he'd been wronged and couldn't prove it yet. Eliza laid the compiled documentation across Alderman's kitchen table. 7 months of invoices cross-referenced against regional market rates. The supplier network map, she'd drawn a web of connected operations that all traced back, through 2 or 3 intermediary steps, to accounts and agents in Briggs' orbit. The timeline of purchase offers Briggs had made to each property, always within weeks of a documented financial pressure spike. Yates looked at the documentation for a long time and then said, very quietly, "I sold for 40 cents on the dollar because I thought the market had gone bad." "The market hadn't gone bad," Eliza said. "Your costs had been artificially inflated for 18 months before the offer came." He put the papers down and didn't say anything else, but his jaw worked in the way jaws work when a man is containing something that would come out wrong if he let it. Ferris, a larger man, louder, less contained, said, "This is enough to take to the county sheriff." "County sheriff has a brother-in-law who works Briggs' North operation," Alderman said. "I think carefully about that." "Silence Merritt," Colton said. "In Laramie. He needs to see this and tell us what avenue is viable." "Merritt's one lawyer," Brandt said. He was a careful talker, said less than anyone else in the room, but what he said was worth hearing. "Briggs has 3 that I know of." "He has 3, Eliza said. "We have 5 ranches, documented evidence of systematic supplier fraud, and a former property owner who can testify to a forced sale under manufactured financial conditions." She looked around the table. "We don't need more lawyers than him. We need one good one, and a case he can't dismiss," Ferris said. "And if Briggs finds out we're doing this before we're ready, he'll apply pressure," Eliza said, "which he may do anyway. Question is whether you want to face that pressure alone, the way each of you has been doing it, or together." The room was quiet. These were men who'd spent their working lives being independent by necessity. The frontier didn't reward cooperation as a habit, Because cooperation required trust and trust required time, and time was the thing the frontier never had enough of. What Eliza was asking them to do went against the grain of how they'd survived. But they were also men who'd been losing, and losing slowly, and running out of ground to retreat to. Alderman spoke first. I'm in. Brant, after a moment, I'm in. Ferris, what do we do first? First, Eliza said, we get everything we have to Merritt and let him assess the strength of the case. Second, we make sure each of your operations is as protected as possible in the meantime. That means tightening your supply arrangements, documenting everything, and not giving Briggs any legitimate financial pressure point to use. She looked at Yates. Your testimony about the sale conditions is important. Merritt needs to hear it. Yates nodded slowly. After the meeting broke up and the other ranchers had ridden out, Colton stood with Eliza in Alderman's yard while the horses were brought around, and the late afternoon was going cool and blue the way Wyoming evenings do at the end of summer, and he said, you planned all of that. I planned the structure of it. I didn't plan what they'd decide. But you knew they'd decide yes. She looked at him. No, I hoped they would. That's different. She pulled on her riding gloves. I've been wrong before. He studied her. Have you? On any of this? She thought about it honestly. I underestimated how quickly Harlan would move. I thought we had more time before the petition. She paused. And I didn't anticipate the county sheriff's situation. That's a problem I don't have a clean answer to yet. He nodded. He appreciated the honesty, more than he would have known how to say. They rode back to the Voss Ranch in the cooling evening, side by side this time, rather than him slightly ahead, the way it had been in those first weeks, and the change in that small geometry was something neither of them mentioned. But both of them knew was there. Briggs made his next move 10 days later, and it was not procedural. 3 sections of the Voss Ranch fence line were cut in a single night, not the old rotted sections that were already scheduled for repair, but the new sections that Pete and Garrison had put up as part of the infrastructure push. Clean cuts, deliberate, done in the dark, sometime between midnight and 4 in the morning. 43 head of cattle were out by morning. It took 2 full days to recover all of them, and they lost 4 to a ravine on the northeast corner that the cattle reached before anyone knew they were loose. Colton stood at the first cut fence line with Garrison and looked at the clean edges of the wire and felt the cold specific anger that had been building since Crane's first visit come fully to the surface. This wasn't random, Garrison said. He didn't need to add anything to that. No, Colton said. You going to tell Eliza? She already knows. She was, in fact, 2 sections down the fence line making her own inspection when Colton came to find her, and she was crouched in the grass with a cut piece of wire in her hand, examining it with the focused attention of someone who was gathering something rather than just looking. She straightened when he came up beside her. The cuts are from the outside, she said. Wire cutters. Someone came through the north property line. Briggs' territory borders us from the north. I know. She handed him the wire. I want Pete to ride the north boundary today and tell me where the entry point was. There may be tracks. That won't prove anything. On its own, no. She looked at him. But in a case that already documents systematic financial manipulation, evidence of physical sabotage changes the character of what Merritt can argue. It moves it from business dispute to something more serious. Her expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't control, a tighter anger than usual, the kind that comes when something is done, not to your plans or your finances, but to the animals in your care. We lost 4 cattle. I know. That's not recoverable. That's just gone. I know, Eliza. She nodded. She handed him the wire. She went to find Pete. That evening she wrote 2 letters. One to Merritt, updating him on the fence situation, and the cattle loss, with the same methodical documentation she brought to everything. One to Alderman, informing him that the situation had escalated and that the other ranches should check their own fence lines and document any irregularities. Alderman's reply came back in 3 days. 2 sections of his south fence had been cut the same week. He'd assumed it was wildlife or general disrepair and had his men fix it without documenting it. He was furious with himself. Brant reported a similar incident, a gate left open, in a way that couldn't be explained by accident. Eliza put all of it in a package and sent it to Merritt by registered courier with a cover. Letter that was 3 pages long and ended with a sentence that was the most direct thing she'd written in. Months. This is no longer a matter of business practice. This is a coordinated campaign of property damage against multiple landowners, and it requires a response at the appropriate level. Merritt wrote back in 6 days. He agreed, and he told her what the appropriate level looked like. It looked like the territorial governor's office, which had jurisdiction over organized land fraud and property crime at a scale that exceeded county authority. It looked like a formal complaint, backed by the documentation Eliza had been building for months. It looked like an alliance of 5 ranches, standing together in public, presenting a case that no one of them could have made alone. It looked, Eliza thought, when she finished Merritt's letter, exactly like what she'd been building toward since the first night she sat at the kitchen table and drew a map of the property on a piece of paper. She went to find Colton. He was in the barn, doing what he did when he was thinking physical work, something that occupied his hands and left his mind free. He was checking tack, running through the bridles with practiced hands in the last of the evening light. She came and leaned against the stall door and said, "Merritt thinks we can go to the governor's office." Colton stopped working. He looked at her. "All 5 ranches together," she said. "Documented fraud case, property damage, documented forced sale. Not guaranteed, but Merritt thinks it's viable." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she waited, which she'd learned to do. "If we do this publicly," he said, "Briggs knows the moment we file. And between filing and any action, he has time to come at us harder than he has yet. Yes, we need to be ready for that. Yes, what does ready look like this time?" She looked at him in the evening light of the barn, with the smell of horses and hay and good honest work around them, and she said, "It looks like all of us. Together. And not moving first, but not flinching when he does." He turned the bridle in his hands. He thought about the fence. He thought about the 4 cattle in the ravine. He thought about his father signing a document he hadn't read carefully enough, and Harlan in the yard reading terms like a verdict, and Eliza climbing off that wagon without flinching. He said, "Tell Merritt to proceed." She nodded. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and the barn was quiet, except for the sound of the horses settling for the night. And outside the Wyoming dark was coming in the way it always did out here, completely, without apology, covering everything equally. Merritt filed the formal complaint with the territorial governor's office on a Thursday in late September, and by the following Monday, Aldous Briggs knew about it. Nobody told him directly. Men like Briggs didn't need direct channels. They had the kind of ambient awareness that comes from years of cultivating relationships with people who were in positions to know things and were willing, for various considerations, to pass those things along. He knew before Merritt's courier had made it halfway back to Laramie. He knew before any of the 5 ranches had received confirmation that the filing had been accepted. What he did with that knowledge was immediate and calculated. He sent Crane to 3 of the 5 ranches within 48 hours. Not to Voss Not Yet, but to Ferris Brandt and a 4th rancher named Alderman, who received Crane on his porch with the expressionless courtesy of a man who had been expecting exactly this and had decided in advance how he was going to handle it. Crane's message was the same at each stop, delivered with the smooth professional affect of a man who'd been coached on exactly what to say and what not to say. Mr. Briggs was aware that certain concerns had been raised through legal channels. Mr. Briggs was open to resolving those concerns through direct negotiation, outside the formal process, before the situation became more complicated and more expensive for everyone involved. Mr. Briggs was prepared to offer improved terms on existing supplier relationships, revised purchase offers on any property where the owner felt the previous offer had been inadequate, and a general goodwill gesture in the form of a waived outstanding balance on certain accounts. It was, Eliza said when Colton relayed what Alderman had told him, almost exactly what she'd expected. "He's trying to fracture us," she said. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, which meant she'd been thinking hard since before he'd come in from the barn. If he can pull one ranch out of the complaint, get them to settle privately, the complaint loses a significant portion of its documented pattern. One ranch's invoices look like a local dispute. 5 ranches look like a system. Alderman held. Colton said, "I know. What about Ferris?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "Ferris is scared." She looked at him. "How scared?" Crane told him the process would take years, and the legal costs would be substantial, and that by the time anything was decided, Briggs could have applied enough supplemental pressure to make the situation. Significantly worse. He sat down across from her. That's not entirely wrong. No, she agreed, it's not. Ferris has a family, 3 kids. His wife is already. He stopped. It's not cowardice. It's a man looking at the size of what he's up against. I know, she turned the cup in her hands. I need to go see Ferris. He might have already decided. Then I need to go before he tells Crane yes. She rode to the Ferris ranch the next morning alone, which Colton had initially objected to and then, after looking at her face, had not. There were things she needed to say to Ferris that would be said differently with Colton in the room, and she suspected she knew what they were. Margaret Ferris answered the door, a small woman with tired eyes and the particular set of jaw that characterized women who'd been holding things together for longer than was sustainable. She looked at Eliza with the wariness of someone who'd heard about her but hadn't yet decided what to make of her. He's out back, Margaret said. Eliza found Daniel Ferris at the fence behind his barn, doing the kind of work that men do when they need to keep their hands busy while their minds are somewhere they'd rather not be. He saw her coming and didn't stop working. I figured you'd come, he said. Are you going to take Briggs' offer? He worked the fence for another moment. Then he stopped and turned around and leaned against the post. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and he looked tired in a way that was bone deep, rather than just from that day's work. My wife is scared, he said. My oldest boy is 14, and he's starting to understand that the ranch might not make it. Every time I go out in the morning, I'm counting what I still have, instead of thinking about what I'm building. He looked at her. You understand what that does to a man? Yes, she said. I do. Your husband's ranch is bigger than mine. Your documentation is stronger. You have more cushion. We had no cushion 2 months ago, she said. We had a drought and a fraudulent supply contract, and a legal trap set by Colton's uncle that could have frozen our operations entirely. We're not coming from a position of strength. We built one out of what we had. He was quiet. I'm not going to tell you what to decide, she said. I'm not going to tell you it's not risky. It is. Merritt has been honest with us about the timeline and the costs and the uncertainty. She stepped closer to the fence. But I want you to think about one thing. If Briggs can pick this apart now, if he can settle with you privately and reduce the complaint to 4 ranches, then 3, then 2 he wins. Not just against us. He continues doing exactly what he's been doing. To the next operation that comes along. And the one after that. Ferris looked at her. Yates lost his ranch, she said. He'll never get it back. He knew he was wronged, and he didn't have anyone to stand next to. She said it without drama, just as the fact it was. You do. He didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the fence and worked another section. And she waited, because she'd learned that the people who needed the most time to decide were often the ones who, once decided, didn't go back. After a while, he said, without turning around, if Briggs comes at us harder after the filing, if there's more fence cutting, more pressure, you're not going to disappear on me, right? Your operation is still going to be in this. Yes, she said. We're still going to be in it. Colton too? Yes. He worked the fence. All right, he said. I'm staying in. She rode home and told Colton, and he said, what did you say to him? Truth, she said. That's usually what works with men like Ferris. Briggs turned his attention to Colton 10 days after the Ferris visit. He didn't send Crane this time. He came himself. That was significant, and Eliza noted it immediately when she saw the carriage coming up the main road, not a working man's horse, but a black lacquered carriage with a driver, kind of vehicle that announced its owner's opinion of himself before he stepped out of it. Aldous Briggs was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years getting exactly what he wanted, often enough to believe that what he wanted was generally what was right. He was heavy-set without being soft, with close-cut gray hair and the groomed precision of someone who understood that appearance is a form of argument. He stepped out of the carriage in front of the Voss main house and looked at the property with the unhurried assessment of a man taking inventory. Colton met him in the yard. Eliza stood at the porch. Briggs looked at her, then at Colton. I'd hoped we could speak privately. We don't have private conversations here, Colton said. My wife is part of this operation. A slight pause, a recalculation of the kind Eliza had seen from Crane and from Harlan and from every man who'd arrived at this property expecting to find a man alone, and found instead that the actual situation was more complicated. Briggs handled it better than most. He simply adjusted. Fine, he said. He looked at Eliza with the particular attention of a man who was revising his assessment of a situation. I understand you're the one who assembled the complaint documentation. I assembled part of it, Eliza said. The other ranchers contributed to the rest. Impressive work. He said it without apparent condescension, which was more unsettling than condescension would have been. You clearly have a significant capability. She said nothing. He turned back to Colton. I'd like to resolve this. I think there are legitimate grievances in what's been filed, and I'm prepared to acknowledge that some of the supplier network practices were inadvertently. I want to stress operating outside standard fair dealing. I'm prepared to make that right. Inadvertently, Colton repeated. Business at scale creates layers, Briggs said. Not everything that happens in those layers reflects the principal's intention. I'm not asking you to accept that as an excuse. I'm telling you it's a factor. What are you offering? Eliza said. He looked at her. She'd stepped down from the porch and was standing beside Colton now. Full restitution to all 5 ranches for documented overbilling over the past 4 years. Independent auditor of your choosing to verify the calculation. Revised supplier terms going forward, independently monitored. And a formal letter acknowledging the irregularities, which you can hold as a private document. It was a substantial offer. Eliza knew it was substantial, and she could see from the slight shift in Colton's posture that he knew it too. Private document, she said. Yes, not filed with the governor's office. That's the point of a private resolution, Briggs said pleasantly. So Yates gets nothing, she said, because his sale happened 3 years ago, and this restitution covers current ranches only. A brief pause. I can include a consideration for the Yates situation. And the supplier network, the actual network, continues operating. Under new terms with us, but the same structure that was applied to us gets applied to the next operation that comes along. Briggs looked at her steadily. You're not going to take the offer. I'm going to tell you why the offer isn't sufficient, she said, which isn't the same thing as not taking it. The offer addresses the financial damage. It doesn't address the mechanism. Restitution without structural change just means the same thing happens to someone else in a different county. That's not your responsibility. Maybe not legally. She held his gaze. But I'll know. Briggs looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a man encountering something he'd underestimated. It wasn't respect exactly, not yet. It was the recalibration that comes before respect when a man realizes he came to a conversation with the wrong set of assumptions. He looked at Colton. Is this her decision or yours? It's ours, Colton said. Briggs nodded slowly. Then I'll tell you what happens next. The governor's process is slow, expensive, and uncertain. My legal team has operated in that environment for 20 years. Yours has not. The outcome is not guaranteed, and in the meantime, your operation, all 5 operations, will continue to be subject to whatever market pressures exist in this county. He said it without explicit threat, just as weather, just as fact. I understand, Colton said. You should consider your wife's position as well, Briggs said. Not nastily strategically. She's built something real here. It would be a shame to see it damaged by a process that may ultimately not produce what she's hoping for. Colton looked at him for a moment. We'll let Merritt know the private resolution wasn't acceptable. You'll hear from the governor's office in due course. Briggs nodded. He looked once more at Eliza, that measuring look, recalculating, and then he got back in the carriage and left. They stood in the yard and watched the carriage go, and neither of them spoke until it had turned out of sight. Then Colton said, He's going to come harder. Yes. You're sure about this? She looked at him. Are you? He thought about it honestly, which was what she needed him to do. He thought about the 4 cattle in the ravine, thought about Yates saying, I sold for 40 cents on the dollar because I thought the market had gone bad. He thought about Ferris at the fence. Yes, he said. I'm sure. What came harder was not what either of them had expected. Harlan Voss filed a secondary legal action 2 weeks after Briggs' visit, not through the governor's office and not in Cheyenne, but through a county judge in a jurisdiction 40 miles east, where Harlan had connections that predated the current situation by 15 years. The action alleged that Eliza, as a non-native party to the Voss estate with no hereditary standing, had exceeded her legal authority in initiating financial agreements and operational changes that materially affected the value and structure of a family property. It was targeted, it was specific, and it named Eliza personally rather than Colton. which was the part that told Eliza everything she needed to know about who had designed the strategy. Briggs hadn't just hired lawyers. He'd found Harlan's specific grievance, his wounded pride about the power of attorney, his genuine belief that Eliza was an interloper, and had given it legal form and funding. Merritt, when he received the filing, was quiet for longer than usual before responding. His letter to Colton and Eliza was careful and thorough, and, underneath its professional language, unmistakably worried. The action had no strong legal foundation, he wrote, but it didn't need strong foundation to be effective as a tactic. It needed only enough foundation to require response, and enough complexity to drag out resolution. And in the meantime, it created a personal legal exposure for Eliza that complicated her ability to act as she'd been acting on the ranch. She read Merritt's letter at the kitchen table on a gray November morning, and Colton sat across from her and watched her read it. And when she set it down, she looked out the window for a long time before she said anything. "It's aimed at me specifically," she said. "I know. They're trying to sideline me without sidelining you." She said it with the flatness of someone naming a thing they've already thought through. "If they can establish that my actions were legally unauthorized, they invalidate the operational decisions I made. Supply contracts, the well project, the meeting documentation. They can't invalidate a well that's already producing water," Colton said. "No, but they can invalidate my standing to have negotiated the Devers contract. They can create grounds for Harlan to contest the power of attorney revocation, because if my participation in that process was unauthorized." She stopped. Clever. I'll give them that. She wasn't frightened. He could see she wasn't frightened. And the fact that she wasn't frightened when she had genuine reason to be, when the thing being attacked was not just the ranch's operations, but her own legal standing as a person in this place, produced something in Colton that he would have had difficulty putting into words. He said, "What do we do?" "We fight it," she said, "but not the way they expect." She wrote to Merritt the same afternoon, and she wrote a second letter, not to a lawyer, but to Colton's father. Raymond Voss was living in a rented house in Rawlins, managed by a hired woman who wrote occasional brief updates on his condition. His health had stabilized from the worst of it, though he was not well, and everyone understood he would not fully recover. He had not responded to Harlan's last 2 letters, and he had not written to Colton since the spring. Eliza's letter to Raymond was 4 pages long. She didn't write it as a daughter-in-law. She wrote it as the person managing his ranch and protecting his son's inheritance, and she laid out everything, the financial situation when she'd arrived, the changes she'd made and why, Harlan's actions and Briggs' actions, and the legal filing that was now aimed at her personally. She wrote it clearly, without self-pity, and without asking for anything specific. She just told him what was happening to the place he'd built and what it was going to cost to protect it. She showed the letter to Colton before she sent it. He read it slowly. When he finished, he looked up at her. "You didn't have to show me this," he said. "It affects your relationship with your father. You should know what I said." He looked at the letter again. He may not respond. Maybe. He may side with Harlan. They've been close their whole lives. Maybe. She folded the letter. "But I think he deserves to know the truth about what's happening to his land. What he does with it is his choice." Colton watched her seal the letter. He thought about his father, the real man, not the idealized version and not the failed version, but the actual complicated human being who'd loved this land and made bad decisions and signed things he shouldn't have and probably felt worse about all of it than he'd ever told anyone. "He'll be on your side," Colton said. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who, having thought about it, had arrived at a conclusion they believed. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who made bad choices and let Harlan manage the guilt of them. But he's not a bad man." She looked at him. "I know," she said. The letter went out the following morning. While they waited, the ranch continued to operate because it had to, because animals need feeding and fences need minding, and a working property doesn't pause for legal uncertainty. November came in cold and dry, the drought finally breaking in the last week of October, with 3 days of serious rain that left the pastures waterlogged and the northeast well flowing full and clean with the particular satisfaction of a thing that was working exactly as intended. Garrison had the bunkhouse roof fully repaired before the rain came, just barely, completed in the last week of October in a push that left 3 men sore and Pete covered in tar and mildly proud of it. When the rain arrived and came through the ceiling onto exactly no one's bed, there was a brief celebration in the bunkhouse that Eliza heard about secondhand from Pete and filed under the category of things that were more important than they appeared. She was working harder than she let on. The personal legal filing had created a weight that she didn't discuss, and that manifested in small ways the extra hours she spent in the office at night, the occasional moment of stillness where she'd stop what she was doing and look at nothing for a few seconds before returning to it. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, because she hadn't invited that conversation, and because he'd learned that Eliza's silences were working silences, not isolation she was processing, not shutting down, and the difference mattered. What he did instead was make sure the practical weight of the operation didn't fall entirely on her during those weeks. He handled the hand management, the pasture rotation, the daily mechanical problems that a ranch produces reliably, regardless of what else is happening. He had dinner ready on the 3 evenings when she was still in the office past dark. He did not announce any of this or draw attention to it. He simply did it, in the way that practical care between two people in a difficult situation tends to happen quietly, without ceremony, as an answer to a question that hasn't been asked out loud. One evening in the second week of November, she came to the kitchen to find he'd made stew, not very good stew. She noted privately, seasoned with the limited inspiration of a man who cooked out of necessity rather than interest. And she sat down and ate it without saying anything about the quality, and he sat across from her and ate his own portion with the equanimity of a man who also knew it wasn't very good and didn't particularly care. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. He nodded. "I know it's not thank you," she said again, more directly, which stopped him because she clearly wasn't talking about the stew. He looked at her. "You haven't made this harder," she said. "You could have. A lot of men would have, whether they meant to or not. You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the November wind was working on the shutters. "You haven't made it easy," he said, "but you've made it worth it. There's a difference." She looked at him across the table in the lamplit kitchen, and there was a long beat between them that held everything that had accumulated in the months since she'd climbed off that wagon, and he'd stood 20 feet away in the yard, not knowing what to say. She said, "I didn't know what kind of man you were when I came here. What do you think now?" She considered it seriously, which was the only way she considered anything. "I think you're a man who does the right thing when it's available to him. And when it's not available, you wait until it becomes available." A slight pause. "That's rarer than it sounds." He looked at her. There was nothing quick or easy in what was forming between them. It was built out of difficulty and work, and the specific intimacy of two people who've been genuinely tested together. And it was real in the way that things built from real material are real. "Raymond wrote back," Colton said. She went still. "When?" "Letter came this afternoon. I wanted to wait until you'd eaten." He reached into his coat pocket and set the letter on the table. It was 2 pages in Raymond Voss's hand, which was looser and less controlled than it had once been, but still legible. She read it. Raymond had written to his lawyer in Rawlins, he said, and had sent instructions for the revocation of Harlan's power of attorney to proceed without challenge. He had also written to Harlan directly, and he'd used language that was blunt in the way a man is blunt when he's been ill long enough to stop softening things. What Harlan had filed against Eliza was not something Raymond would support, and if Harlan continued with it, Raymond would make his position public, through whatever channel was necessary. He also wrote, in the last paragraph, something addressed not to Colton, but to Eliza directly, which was how she knew he understood, whose letter had actually reached him. "I have made poor decisions with land that my father worked all his life to leave me. I know this. If you are doing what you say you're doing, then my son has more luck than I deserved to give him. Keep the north pasture fencing maintained. There was always a problem there I never solved." She folded the letter and set it on the table. Colton said, "He's on your side." "I know." She pressed her hand flat on the folded letter. "Did you know he'd respond like that?" "I told you he would. You had more confidence than I did." "He's my father," Colton said. "I know what he looks like when he's wrong about something and knows it." He paused. "He's been wrong about Harlan for years. I think he knew it and didn't know how to undo it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind hit the shutters again, and the lamp flickered once. "This doesn't end the legal filing," she said. "Harlan's already submitted it. Raymond's opposition helps, but it doesn't automatically dismiss it. No. But Merritt says that with Raymond's active opposition and the original power of attorney now fully revoked, the standing of the complaint is significantly weakened. Significantly isn't completely. No, he agreed. But it's something. She stood and took both plates to the basin and washed them the way she always did, efficiently, without fuss. He watched her from the table and thought about what she'd said earlier. You haven't made this harder. He thought about all the ways he could have made it harder. The 20 feet of distance in the yard on the day she arrived. The months of half-trust and waiting. The times he'd accepted her judgment without telling her directly that he'd accepted it. Eliza, he said. She turned. I should have said earlier, months ago, probably, that what you've done here is. He stopped, because he was not a man who'd had much practice saying this kind of thing. And the vocabulary felt awkward in his mouth, even when the feeling behind it was not. This ranch is better. Not just financially. The men are better. The whole operation is. I can see what it's supposed to do now, and I couldn't before. She looked at him. She didn't deflect it or minimize it, which was something he'd come to understand about her. She didn't perform modesty when honesty was what the moment called for. She just accepted it, the way a person accepts something they've worked hard for and know they earned. That's because you let it happen, she said. You had to decide to let it happen, and you did. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't splitting the credit to be kind. It was just accurate, and they both knew it. Harlan withdrew the legal filing in the 3rd week of November. Not because he wanted to. Because Raymond had sent a letter to the county judge, not to the lawyer, directly to the judge, making his position clear in language that removed any ambiguity about the family's unified stance. Raymond might not have been well and might not have been present, but the Voss name still carried weight in this territory, and a judge with any interest in his own continued standing was not going to proceed with an action the family patriarch had publicly opposed. Merritt confirmed the withdrawal with a brief letter that was, by his standards, almost celebratory in its understated satisfaction. Eliza read it and sat quietly for a long moment. Then she went to find Garrison, because there were 3 fence repairs that had been deferred during the legal uncertainty, and she wanted them back on schedule before the hard winter made the ground too frozen to work. She didn't announce the withdrawal to the hands. She didn't make anything of it. She just went back to work, which was, Colton thought when Pete told him where she'd gone, exactly the right thing to do. But there was still Briggs. The governor's complaint was proceeding slowly, with the grinding institutional pace that Merritt had warned them about. The territorial office had sent an initial inquiry to the Briggs operations legal representatives. Those representatives had responded with the predictable layering of objection and counter-documentation that was designed less to resolve anything than to extend everything. Merritt estimated they were still months from any meaningful hearing. In the meantime, Briggs had gone quiet. That quiet was not comfort. Eliza had said from the beginning that a man like Briggs didn't run out of moves, he conserved them, and silence was itself a move, and you only went quiet when you were preparing something you didn't want observed in advance. She said as much to Colton on a cold December afternoon, when they were going through the winter supply inventory together, which had become a regular working session her with the ledger, him checking the physical stock and calling out counts, the kind of collaborative domestic efficiency that had developed between them naturally over the months, without either of them having planned it. He's going to do something before the hearing, she said. He needs to change the conditions of the case before it gets to the stage where the documentation is presented. Can he actually do at this point? Harlan's out. The revocation is complete. The financial case is filed. He can damage credibility. If one of the ranches withdraws, or if there's a scandal attached to the complaint, or if she paused. Has Ferris been all right? You talked to him last week? He's holding. He's worried, but he's holding. Brant? Brant is solid. She turned a ledger page. The weakest point is the Yates testimony. He's not a current rancher. He has no ongoing economic interest in the outcome. Briggs' lawyers will argue he's a disgruntled former property owner with a grudge, and that his records are incomplete. Are they incomplete? Partially. There are 18 months where the documentation is thin. It's not fatal to the case, but it's a gap. She made a note. I've been thinking about whether there's a way to corroborate the Yates timeline from another source. What kind of source? She looked up. Do you know if anyone at the Cheyenne Supply Exchange keeps historical transaction records? Colton thought about it. There's an exchange registry. They've kept ledgers going back 20 years. She was quiet for a moment. If the supplier pricing Briggs network applied to Yates during that period is reflected in the exchange registry, even partially it corroborates the Yates documents without needing Yates to fill the gaps. Colton looked at her. That's in Cheyenne, I know. Someone needs to go look at it. Yes. He put down his stock sheet. I'll go. I should go. You're managing the winter inventory and the Ferris check-in, and the merit correspondence, he said. And I have more of a reason to be in the Cheyenne Exchange without raising flags ranchers, go there for supply business all the time. A lawyer's wife showing up to review historical transaction ledgers is more conspicuous. She thought about this. It was right, and she knew it was right, which didn't make accepting it entirely without friction. Because Eliza was not a person who easily let the active parts of a situation be handled by someone else. You're looking for transaction records from the Tilson and Crane-adjacent supplier accounts, she said. 1,877 through 1,880 is the primary window. You want pricing data, not just what was sold, but what margin was applied above the exchange standard rate. I know how to read a supply ledger. I know you do. She almost smiled. I know what I'm looking for, and I need to make sure you're looking for the same thing. Write it down, he said. I'll take it with me. She wrote him 3 pages of specific instructions that evening, which he read carefully and folded into his coat pocket, and in the morning he rode for Cheyenne. She stood on the porch and watched him go, and the watching was different from how she'd watched him head for Casper on the equipment contract this time. She wasn't worried about whether he'd make it in time. She was just watching. The way you watch someone ride out when you've come to understand that their coming back matters to you. It's in a way that's become ordinary, which is the best way for something to matter. He was gone for 5 days. The ranch didn't collapse. Of course it didn't, she was there, and Garrison and Pete were there, and the operation had developed enough structural soundness over the past months that it didn't need Colton's physical presence every day to keep running. But the house was different when he wasn't in it, and she noticed the difference in the evening, particularly in the kitchen, in the way the lamp threw the same light over the same table, and the room was quiet, in a way that was just quiet rather than the companionable working silence she'd gotten used to. On the 4th day, she received a short note from him. He'd found the exchange ledgers, and the records were there, and what was in them was more than she'd hoped for. He came back on the evening of the 5th day with 24 pages of careful transcriptions in his own handwriting, not copies, because the exchange wouldn't permit copying, but detailed notes that captured what mattered. He handed them to her at the door before he'd even taken off his coat, and she took them to the office and spread them across the desk and went through them systematically, while he put his own horse up and got water and came back to stand in the office doorway watching her work. After 20 minutes, she looked up. This covers the full Yates period, she said. Yes, the margin discrepancy during those 18 months, it's in the exchange record. The Tilson account was applying a 17% markup above the standard exchange rate. That was the high end, Colton said. There are 2 other accounts in there with the same pattern, same timeline. She looked at the pages. Then she looked at him. This fills the gap. Yes, this fills the gap and then some. She set the pages down carefully. Merritt needs to see these immediately. I know. I'll write tonight. She stood. She was looking at him in the doorway in his road-worn coat with the Cheyenne dust still on him, and the expression on her face was one that he hadn't seen before, not her focused working look, and not her controlled careful look, but something that had come loose from both of those and was just present and direct and warm. You read a supply ledger, she said. You told me what to look for. Still, he looked back at her. They were standing 6 feet apart in the office of a ranch that had been failing when she arrived and was not failing now, with 20 pages of exchange records on the desk that were going to change the character of what Merritt could argue in Cheyenne. I told you I'd come, he said. I know. She picked up the papers and aligned them carefully into a stack. I'm starting to count on it. He watched her work, and outside the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winters do indifferently, completely, covering everything, and inside the lamp was warm, and the ranch was quiet, and both of them were exactly where they'd decided, separately and together, to be. Merritt presented the Cheyenne Exchange records to the territorial governor's office in the first week of January, and the response was different from what had come before. Previous correspondence from the governor's office had been procedural acknowledgments, requests for additional documentation, scheduling notices written in the careful language of institutional machinery that moves slowly by design. This response was something else. It came by fast courier rather than regular post, and it was addressed not only to Merritt but jointly to all 5 complaining ranches by name, and it requested that representatives of each property present themselves in Cheyenne within 3 weeks for a formal preliminary hearing before the Territorial Land Commissioner. Merritt's cover letter accompanying the notice was 3 sentences long, which was, for Merritt, the equivalent of shouting. The exchange records changed the evidentiary character of the complaint. What had been a pattern of disputed business practice was now a documented case of coordinated price manipulation with traceable institutional records. The governor's office was not going to let this sit in procedural limbo. Eliza read both letters, standing at the kitchen table, and then sat down, which she rarely did in the middle of the workday. Colton came in from the barn and found her there and said, "What happened?" She handed him the letters. He read them. His face go through several things that he didn't announce. 3 weeks, he said. "We need to contact all 5 ranches today. Alderman, Ferris, Brant, Yates. Everyone needs to be in Cheyenne." She was already thinking through the logistics, who had the means to travel in January, who would need support, what documentation each ranch needed to bring. Yates doesn't have a horse that can make that distance in winter. Someone needs to bring him. Pete can go get Yates. Yes, and Garrison can manage here while we're gone. She paused. We need to go together. All 5 ranches in that hearing room. That's the point, that it's not one grievance. It's a pattern. And the pattern is only visible when everyone is in the same room, saying the same thing. He looked at the letters again. Briggs will have his lawyers there. I know. This could still go wrong. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. But it's the right fight. We're in the right place. And we have the right documents. She said it without bravado, just as an assessment, the way she assessed everything. That's all you ever actually have. You make it count or you don't. He put the letters on the table. I'll ride to Alderman this afternoon. I'll write to Ferris and Brant. They moved. That was the thing about them by now. When a decision was made, they moved, without the friction of having to reestablish who was doing what or why. The months had worn down all the unnecessary structure and left something functional and direct underneath. It wasn't effortless nothing. Real is effortless, but it was honest. And honest working partnerships between people who've stopped pretending tend to cover ground quickly. The January ride to Cheyenne was 2 days through weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, alternating between hard cold with clear skies and a low gray cloud cover that threatened snow without delivering it. They rode in a group, Colton and Eliza, Alderman and Helen, Ferris, Brant, Yates, and Pete, who had brought Yates from his rented room in the county town of Millbrook, and who was there primarily because Colton had said he'd earned the right to see it through. Helen Alderman, who had not said much at the ranchers' meeting months ago, but had been paying attention to everything, rode beside Eliza for most of the first day. They talked about the practical things first, the hearing process, what Merritt had told them to expect, how long they might need to be in Cheyenne. Then, toward the end of the afternoon, when the light was going amber and flat across the winter plain, Helen said, "You're not nervous." "I'm nervous," Eliza said. "You don't look it. I look the way I look when I'm nervous." Eliza adjusted her grip on the reins. "I go quieter. I stop talking about the thing I'm worried about and talk about everything around it instead." Helen considered this. Nathan does the opposite. Gets louder. That works too, does it? Helen looked at her sideways. "I always thought the loudness was for him, not for anyone else." Eliza didn't answer immediately, which was her way of agreeing with something she didn't want to say at someone else's husband's expense. Helen noticed and seemed to appreciate the discretion. "What happens if the hearing doesn't go the way you want?" Helen said. "Then we use what we have and we go somewhere else with it." Eliza kept her eyes on the road ahead. The exchange records don't disappear if one hearing goes badly. The documentation doesn't disappear. We find another channel. And if there isn't another channel, there's always another channel, Eliza said. Just sometimes the channel is harder and slower and less satisfying than the one you wanted. She paused. But Briggs has been operating this way for 20 years because nobody ever had enough documentation to make it worth the effort to fight. We have the documentation. That's not nothing. Whatever happens in that hearing room, we walk out with more than we walked in with because the record exists now and it didn't before. Helen was quiet for a moment. Nathan wasn't sure about you when you first came here, she said. He told me he thought Colton had made a bad arrangement. A lot of people thought that. What did you think? When you first arrived, Eliza thought about the wagon, and Harlan's voice reading terms in the yard, and Colton standing 20 feet away. She thought about the kitchen that first night and the plate he'd found without being asked. I thought I had more work ahead of me than I'd planned for, she said. But I also thought the land was better than anyone was using it, and I thought she stopped. I thought if the man could hear things, there was something worth building. Helen looked at her. And could he? Eliza glanced back toward where Colton was riding with Alderman and Ferris, talking about something in the easy shorthand of men who'd worked adjacent problems together long enough to trust each other's judgment. Yes, she said. He could. Cheyenne in January was cold and busy in the way that territorial capitals are busy the particular density of people with agendas, clerks with forms, lawyers with schedules, and the steady institutional hum of a place where decisions are made that affect people who are not in the room. Merritt met them at the hotel on the evening before the hearing. He was a compact man in his 50s with a methodical quality that had initially struck Eliza as dry and had gradually revealed itself as the specific kind of calm that comes from having seen many difficult situations and understanding that panic is never the variable that determines outcomes. He went through the hearing structure with all of them gathered in the hotel's small meeting room, the Voss party, the aldermans, Ferris, Brandt, Yates at the end of the table, looking like a man who'd been carrying a weight for 3 years and was finally in a room where he might be allowed to set it down. The land commissioner is a man named Holt, Merritt said. He's not soft and he's not corrupt. He's a proceduralist, which means the quality of the documentation matters more than the quality of the argument. What we have, he touched the organized stack of files in front of him, is unusually strong on documentation. What they will do is attack the interpretation of that documentation and the standing of the witnesses. Particularly Yates, Eliza said. Yes, Yates is the most vulnerable because his sale is historical and his records have the gap. Merritt looked at Yates. The exchange records Mr. Voss retrieved fill the factual gap, but they'll argue you held onto those invoices selectively, that your memory of the period is unreliable, that you had grievances against Briggs unrelated to the pricing. I did have grievances, Yates said. They caused me to have grievances. Yes, Merritt said. That's the nature of being wronged. The challenge is that, in a formal setting, the grievance and the evidence need to be clearly separated, or the defense will argue that one is contaminating the other. He looked at Yates steadily. When you speak tomorrow, I need you to answer only what I ask. Not what you're feeling, not what you think they should know. Only what I ask. Yates nodded. He didn't look happy about it, but he nodded. The exchange records are the cornerstone, Merritt continued. Everything builds from them. Because they're institutional, nobody can argue they were fabricated or selectively preserved, because the exchange maintains them independently. The pattern across 5 ranches is visible in the numbers, and when it's placed alongside the timeline of Briggs' purchase offers, the sequence is, he paused, choosing his word carefully. Convincing. Convincing to Holt? Ferris asked. Convincing to any reasonable person who reads the documents without a financial interest in the outcome, Merritt said. Holt qualifies. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the ranchers dispersed to their rooms, and Eliza sat with Merritt for another 20 minutes going through the documentation order. One more time, not because she hadn't memorized it, but because going through it again was the thing she needed to do the night before a hearing she'd been building toward for 7 months. When she finally stood to leave, Merritt said, "You know this is not a guarantee." "I know. Even with everything we have, Holt may find the institutional intervention insufficient for the scale of remedy we're requesting. I know that too." She picked up her coat. "But the documentation exists now. Even in the worst outcome, the record of what Briggs did exists in a formal proceeding. That's harder to undo than a private settlement." She looked at him. "You said that yourself. Months ago." He allowed himself something close to a smile. "I did. Get some sleep, Merritt." She went to find Colton. He was in the room they'd taken, sitting at the small desk by the window with the lamp low, looking at nothing in particular. She recognized the posture, not worry exactly, but the gathering in that people do the night before something large. She sat on the edge of the bed across from him and said, "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said. Then, because he'd learned by now that fine was not what either of them actually meant when they said it, "I'm thinking about my father." She waited. "He should be here," Colton said. "Not in the room, he couldn't travel. But he should know what's happening tomorrow." He was quiet a moment. This started with him making a bad decision with a good piece of land. And now there are 5 families in this building who might get something back because of work that you did. He looked at her. "That's a strange arc." "All arcs are strange when you look at them end to end," she said. "In the middle, you're just working." He looked at her. "Were you scared when you came here?" "In the beginning." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she answered him anymore. "Yes, but not of Harlan or the situation or you." She paused. "I was scared I'd be wrong about the land, that I'd looked at those numbers in my father's office and convinced myself there was something worth building, and there wasn't. That it was just debt and deterioration, and I'd committed myself to something that couldn't be saved." "But it could," he said. "It could." She met his eyes. "You could." He held her gaze. There was, between them in that small room, in Cheyenne the night before the hearing, something that had grown so gradually and from such unpromising ground that it almost defied accounting, not love in the storybook way, not the clean, uncomplicated version. Something more like the real thing, which is built from months of shared difficulty and honest disagreement and practical care and the particular trust that comes from watching someone be exactly who they said they were when it was hard to be. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not dramatically, just reached across and held it. And she let him, and neither of them said anything else, and the lamp burned low, and outside Cheyenne went about its nighttime business without caring about any of it. That was enough. Sometimes enough is exactly what it is. The hearing convened at 9 in the morning in a room that smelled like old paper and institutional cold, the particular chill of a government building that doesn't heat its formal spaces until they're actually occupied, which means the first hour is conducted in coats. Land Commissioner Holt was in his late 60s, broad-faced, with the deliberate physical stillness of a man who'd presided over too many rooms to feel the need to demonstrate authority through movement. He read the complaint summary into the record without expression, acknowledged the documentation package Merritt had submitted, noted the representation on both sides, and said, in a voice that was neither welcoming nor hostile, "We'll begin with the complainants." Briggs' legal team occupied the right side of the room, 3 men in good suits who'd clearly worked together before and had the coordinated ease of a practiced unit. Briggs himself sat behind them, not at the table, in a chair against the wall. He was watching everything and showing nothing. Eliza sat beside Merritt at the complainant's table. Colton sat directly behind her. The other ranchers were ranged in the seats behind them, and their presence, 5 sets of working hands, 5 sets of frontier-worn faces, had a cumulative weight that the room absorbed without comment. Merritt presented the case with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did, and it was, in that room with Commissioner Holt, following every line of documentation, with the focused attention of a man who did this seriously, genuinely impressive. He walked through the supplier network first, the exchange records, the documented margin discrepancy, the crane connections, then the individual ranch documentation, the Voss invoices, the alderman records, the Ferris and Brandt materials, then the timeline of purchase offers, each one following a period of documented financial pressure with a consistency that, laid out in sequence, was not explainable by coincidence. Then Yates. Caleb Yates took the chair beside Merritt and answered questions with the flat, careful precision of a man who'd been told what to say and had decided the instruction was right. He was not a polished witness. He had the roughness of someone who'd spent 30 years outdoors and was uncomfortable in a formal room, and he held his hat in his lap and gripped it too tight. But when Merritt asked him specific questions about specific transactions in specific months, Yates answered correctly and consistently, and the exchange records corroborated him every time. Briggs' lead lawyer, a man named Caulfield, who had the smooth professional affect of someone who'd spent his career making reasonable-sounding arguments for unreasonable positions, conducted a cross-examination that was pointed and skilled that tried repeatedly to establish Yates as a bitter man with an axe to grind and incomplete records. He wasn't wrong that the records were incomplete in places, but every gap he pointed to, Merritt closed on redirect with the exchange ledger page that covered it. Caulfield knew about the exchange records, he'd seen them in Merritt's submission, but he hadn't found a way to attack their credibility because they weren't Yates's records, and they weren't Merritt's records, and they weren't any of the rancher's records. They were the exchange's records, institutional, independent, maintained without knowledge of or interest in this specific dispute. That was the thing Eliza had understood when Colton came back from Cheyenne with those transcription pages. That was why she'd sat down at the kitchen table when she read the hearing notice. Not because the road was suddenly easy, but because the cornerstone was finally solid. Caulfield tried one more angle in his final cross-examination of Yates. "Mr. Yates," he said pleasantly, "isn't it possible that the pricing you experienced during this period reflected legitimate market volatility rather than deliberate manipulation? Frontier supply costs fluctuate significantly." Yates looked at him. Then he looked at Holt. Then he looked back at Caulfield and said, "The exchange sets a standard rate. Suppliers who work through the exchange agree to apply that rate plus a documented margin. The margin applied to my account during those 18 months was 17% above the standard. The exchange record shows it. Are you saying the exchange made a mistake?" Silence. Caulfield said, "No, I'm not suggesting. Because if the exchange made a mistake, that's a different hearing," Yates said. "The exchange didn't make a mistake, then the margin was what it was, and someone chose to apply it to my account." Merritt didn't object or redirect. He didn't need to. Holt made a note. The defense presentation was competent. Caulfield argued market conditions, argued complexity of supply networks, argued that the purchase offers, following financial pressure, were coincidental rather than coordinated, argued that absent direct evidence linking the supplier pricing decisions to Briggs personally, the complaint was built on inference. It was the best argument available from the available facts, and Eliza knew it was the best argument available and had known it since the beginning. The gap between what could be documented and what could be proven direct was real, and Caulfield knew how to stand in that gap. Commissioner Holt was a proceduralist, and what he did with proceduralists, what good proceduralists always do, was follow the documents where they led without manufacturing a bridge for the space the documents didn't cover. At the end of the second day, Holt said he would have his findings within 30 days. He thanked both parties for their documentation and adjourned. 30 days. Outside the hearing room, in the corridor, Merritt said to Eliza and Colton and the assembled ranchers, "That was as well as we could have done." "Is that good enough?" Ferris asked. "I don't know," Merritt said. He said it honestly, which was more useful than reassurance would have been. "I think the exchange records are hard to dismiss. I think Holt is the right person to be deciding this. I think there is a genuine chance of a favorable finding." He paused. "But I won't tell you it's certain." Alderman said, "What do we do for 30 days? "Go home," Merritt said. "Work your ranches. Don't do anything that looks like anticipation of an outcome either way." They went home. The 30 days were the strangest of the whole business because there was nothing left to do except wait, and waiting is the one thing that working people on working land are worst at. The ranch kept demanding attention, January always did, with its particular combination of bitter cold and increased livestock vulnerability and the mechanical failures that cold weather applied to everything made of metal and wood. Eliza worked, Colton worked, the hands worked. Garrison managed the north pasture through a cold snap that froze 2 water troughs and required 3 straight days of supplemental labor. And Pete, who had developed over the past months into something closer to a foreman than a hand, organized the rotation without being asked. The ranch was running, properly running, in a way that it hadn't been when Eliza arrived. Not perfectly, nothing ran perfectly, and perfection was not a concept that had ever applied to the frontier in any era, but functionally, with the structural soundness that comes from addressed problems rather than managed symptoms. The bunkhouse was weather-tight. The northeast well was producing. The supply contracts were clean, the books balanced in a way that reflected reality rather than hope. On the 19th day, a letter arrived from Merritt. Not the findings, those were still 11 days out, but a piece of intelligence that he'd obtained through a contact at the governor's office. Briggs had withdrawn his legal representatives from the complaint proceedings. Not formally settled, not counterfiled, just withdrawn. Quietly, without announcement, 3 days after the hearing. Eliza read the letter and said, "He knows." Colton looked at her. "Knows what?" "He knows how it's going to go." She set the letter on the desk. A man like Briggs doesn't withdraw representation unless his lawyers have told him the finding is going to go against him, and the best position is not to have made additional legal arguments that get cited in the decision. She looked at Colton. He's cutting his losses. Does that affect what Holt decides? No, Holt decides on the record as it stands. She thought for a moment. But it means Briggs is already thinking about the aftermath, which means he's going to manage his retreat carefully. He's not going to fight what's coming. He's going to try to manage how it lands. On the 28th day, Commissioner Holt's findings arrived. Merritt sent them by fast courier with a cover letter that was, this time, 4 sentences long. Fourth sentence was, "This is a favorable outcome." The findings were detailed and precise 26 pages of formal prose that documented, in the Territorial Land Commissioner's language, the following: that a coordinated supplier pricing scheme had been applied systematically to multiple ranching operations in the county over a period of 4 years, that the scheme had operated through supplier accounts connected to the operational sphere of Aldous Briggs, though direct personal culpability was noted as partially obscured by the intermediary network, that the resulting financial pressure on the complainant operations had materially affected their economic position, that the historical sale of the Yates property had occurred under conditions that, given the documented pricing environment, could not be said to represent fair market conditions, and that appropriate remedies were recommended, including full financial restitution to all 5 complainant ranches based on independently verified overbilling, a territorial injunction against the supplier network practices identified in the complaint, and a formal referral to the Territorial Attorney's Office for further investigation of the Briggs organization's business conduct. It was not everything. The direct personal finding against Briggs was qualified the intermediary network had done its job of providing distance, and Holt could not put Briggs's name on the deliberate decision without the kind of direct evidence that the exchange records, for all their value, didn't provide. The attorney referral was not a conviction. It was an opening, not a conclusion. But the injunction was real. The restitution was real. The formal record, now part of the territorial proceedings, was permanent and public. Eliza sat with the findings for a long time before she called the other ranchers. She sat at the desk in the office of the Voss Ranch, her office now, in the way that a space becomes yours. After you've worked in it long enough with the 26 pages in front of her and the winter light coming through the window at the angle it came through in late January, and she thought about the day she arrived. About Harlan's voice in the document read like a verdict, and Colton standing far enough away that he might as well have been on a different property. About the way she'd climbed down from the wagon and felt the dirt of this place under her boots for the first time, and thought, the land is good. Whatever else is wrong here, the land is good. She hadn't been wrong about the land. She hadn't been wrong about Colton either. Colton came in from the barn to find her reading the findings for the second time, and she looked up at him and said, "We won. Not all of it, but enough of it." He crossed the room and she handed him the findings, and he read them at the desk beside her, both of them in the same space, and when he set the pages down, he was quiet for a moment. "Yates gets restitution," he said. "Yes, not the ranch, but something. Yes." She looked at the findings. "The attorney referral is going to follow Briggs for years. His lawyers know how to slow it down and complicate it, but it doesn't go away. That's a different kind of consequence than a fine or a formal finding. It's ongoing, it's institutional, and it changes how anyone who wants to do business with him has to think about that relationship." Colton nodded. "The supplier network is enjoined, which means the next ranching operation he decides to pressure doesn't have that mechanism available to him." She said it quietly. "That's not nothing." No, he looked at her. None of this was nothing. He meant all of it. From the northeast corner with its hand-dug well to the kitchen table, with the hand-drawn map, to the meeting in the main barn with the lantern light, and the hands who'd never been asked the right questions before. From Garrison and Pete and Alderman and Ferris, who'd stayed in when it would have been easier not to. From Merritt and his meticulous letters and Colton's 5 days in Cheyenne reading exchange ledgers by lamplight. From Eliza, who'd climbed off a wagon into a place that hadn't wanted her and built something real out of what was there. None of it was nothing. All of it was the opposite. She wrote to each ranch herself, not through Merritt, not through courier formality, but personal letters in her own hand that told each of them what the findings contained and what came next and what she thought it meant. She wrote to Yates last and longest, and the letter to Yates said things that the formal findings didn't say, that what had been done to him was wrong, that the record now said so permanently, and that even if the specific remedy fell short of restoring what he'd lost, it was not the same as nothing. It was not the same as the silence he'd been living in for 3 years. Yates wrote back in a hand that was not practiced and took a full week to arrive, and it was 4 lines. And the last line was, "I slept better this week than I have in 3 years." Eliza kept that letter. Spring came to the Voss Ranch, the way it always came to Wyoming grudgingly at first, in small parcels of warmth between cold snaps, and then all at once, as if the season had been building to something, and finally committed. The north pasture showed green by the second week of April. The northeast, well, running since the previous summer, fed the cattle through the winter without a single significant failure. The new hay cutter that Colton had ridden to Casper for in the middle of a legal crisis reduced their feed costs by 30% in the first full season of use. The Devers supply agreement was working so well that Brant and Alderman had quietly approached Eliza about whether Devers would extend the same terms to their operations if multiple ranches came as a consolidated group. Devers said yes. That was the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, but was in the process of becoming a loose cooperative arrangement among the 5 ranches, built not on formal legal structure, but on the simpler and more durable foundation of shared self-interest and mutual trust developed through shared difficulty. They pooled supply orders. They shared labor during peak seasons. When Ferris had a difficult spring with his eldest son's illness leaving him short-handed, Garrison sent 2 men over for 3 weeks without being asked and without any formal accounting of what was owed. That was how it worked. Not cleanly, not perfectly, not without friction and occasional misunderstanding. But it worked. Briggs was not finished. Men like Briggs were never finished exactly, but he was changed. The territorial attorney's investigation had opened formally in February and was proceeding at the institutional pace of such things, which meant it would likely take years and produce a mixed outcome. But the supplier network was enjoined, and the purchase offer pressure that had characterized his approach had become legally and reputationally complicated, and the 5 ranches of the county had demonstrated that they were not individually isolable anymore. He could still cause trouble. He could not cause the specific kind of trouble that had been his preferred instrument. He turned his attention elsewhere. Not out of character men like Briggs, change character, but out of the practical recognition that some targets are no longer worth the cost. Harlan made no further moves. Raymond's letter had been the end of his leverage within the family, and the revocation of the power of attorney, now complete and filed, had been the end of his formal authority. He had a life outside the Voss Ranch, his own accounts, his own connections, and he retreated to it without formally acknowledging that the retreat was happening. He and Colton did not repair their relationship, because the repair would have required Harlan to admit something he wasn't built for admitting, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But they arrived at a distance that was stable, which was different from war and different from warmth, and was probably the closest to honest this particular situation allowed. Raymond Voss came to the ranch in May. He came with a hired driver and a walking stick, and the particular dignity of a man who knows he is diminished, but refuses to make that diminishment anyone else's burden. He walked the property slowly, with Colton on one side and the walking stick on the other, and he said very little about what he saw, except one comment about the bunkhouse roof that was gruff and complimentary, in the specific way that Raymond Voss expressed approval by criticizing what it had been before. He spent an evening in the main house with Colton and Eliza, and dinner was plain, and the conversation was careful in the way that conversation is careful when there is history that can't be unmade, but also can't be the whole stories going forward. At one point, Raymond looked at Eliza across the table and said, "The north pasture fencing." "Maintained," she said. "Garrison replaced the rotted posts last October." He nodded. He looked at his son. Then he looked back at Eliza. You wrote me an honest letter, he said. Yes, most people don't write honest letters. They write letters they want you to agree with. I needed you to know what was happening, she said, not what I wanted you to think about what was happening. He was quiet for a moment. I spent 3 years being managed by Harlan, he said. I knew it and I let it happen because it was easier than the alternative. He said it plainly, without self-pity and without excuse. That's on me. Nobody disagreed and nobody offered absolution, which was the right response to a man taking genuine account of himself. Colton poured his father more water. Eliza cleared the plates. Raymond stayed 2 days and left with the walking stick and the hired driver and something in his posture that was lighter than when he'd arrived. Colton watched the carriage go and stood in the yard for a long moment. Eliza came to stand beside him. He'll be all right, she said. He won't be well, Colton said. No, but all right is different from well. She looked at him. All right is a real thing. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was not something he'd done before, and she leaned into it without ceremony. And they stood in the yard of the Voss Ranch, watching the carriage disappear up the main road, while behind them, the property went about its spring business, the sounds of the barn, the hands in the distance, the particular quality of Wyoming air in May that carries everything on it. There is something that people tend to get wrong about resilience. They imagine it as a property of certain exceptional individuals, a quality that some people are born with and others aren't. But what Eliza Hartwell's story suggests, if you look at it honestly, is that resilience isn't a quality at all. It's a practice. It's the daily decision to do the next thing. Even when the next thing is hard, even when nobody in the yard is watching, even when the evidence suggests that doing the next thing won't be enough. She didn't save the Voss Ranch because she was extraordinary. She saved it because she showed up and kept showing up and paid attention to what was actually there rather than what she wished was there. And she found, in the actual there, enough to work with. And Colton Voss didn't become a better man because a woman changed him, which is a story people tell too often and which gives credit where it doesn't belong. He became a better man because he made the choice repeatedly to let what was in front of him be more important than his pride about how it had arrived. That's not transformation. That's just willingness. But willingness, compounded over enough difficult months, produces something that can look from the outside like transformation. The truth is less romantic and more useful than transformation. The truth is that people can grow when they decide to, and they stop growing when they decide that growing is too much trouble. Colton decided to keep going. That was his part of it, and it was not a small part. What they built together, the ranch, the cooperative among the 5 properties, the legal record that changed the conditions of doing business in that county, was not a monument to anyone's greatness. It was the accumulated result of ordinary decisions made correctly over a long period, mostly when nobody was watching, and when there was no guarantee any of it would work out. Most things that last are built that way. The valley that had once been called marginal the northeast corner of the Voss property, where the hand-dug well sat under cedar and rock and produced clean water through every season, eventually became the center of something larger. It happened gradually in the way that things happen when a place is managed by someone who sees not only what it is, but what it wants to be. Eliza extended the water infrastructure to the full northeast section over 3 seasons. The section became productive pasture. Productivity attracted the interest of 2 neighboring families who'd been running marginal operations to the east and who'd heard through the slow social communication of the frontier that something different was happening at the Voss place. One of them came to ask about the cooperative supply arrangement. The other came to ask about water access. Both of them stayed. By the end of the 3rd year, what had been 5 isolated ranches struggling against manufactured pressure had become something closer to a functioning community not formally organized, not governed by any document, but held together by the web of mutual obligation and shared practice that develops when people who've been through something hard together decide to keep choosing each other. Eliza ran the cooperative supply coordination from the main office, her office, and she ran it with the same methodical honesty she'd brought to everything else. She made mistakes. The winter of the 2nd year, she misjudged the feed inventory, and 3 ranches came up short in February, and it required an emergency arrangement with deavers that cost more than it should have. She fixed it, documented what had gone wrong, and didn't make the same error again. She was not perfect. She didn't need to be. Colton ran the land. He was good at the land he always had been, which was part of why the ranch's failure had hurt him, in the specific way it had, because it was not a failure of effort but of system. And he'd blamed himself for a systems problem, the way people do when they don't yet have the language to distinguish between the two. With the systems addressed and the structure functional, what he was good at could actually do its work. He was on the property before dawn most mornings. He knew every section of the Voss land the way you know something you love, not just its facts, but its moods. The way it changes through the seasons, the specific places where it was strong, and the specific places that still needed watching. He and Eliza argued sometimes. Not often, and not badly, but they were too different in how they approached problems to agree about everything. And they'd both decided early that pretending to agree was a worse outcome than disagreeing honestly. She thought in systems, and he thought in particulars. And the collision of those two modes of thinking was occasionally frustrating and often productive. They'd learned to stay in disagreements long enough to find what was worth keeping from each position, which is not a skill that comes naturally to anyone and which both of them had to practice. That was their marriage. Not a fairy tale, not a business arrangement, not the cautious provisional thing it had started as. Something that had been built, the way everything real is built from available materials, by people who were willing, over time, and with more difficulty than anyone would have chosen if they'd had the choice. On a morning in the 5th autumn, after Eliza had climbed off that wagon into the Voss yard, she was riding the northeast section to check the water infrastructure before the winter prep began, and she pulled up her horse at the edge of the high point that overlooked the valley, the full sweep of it, the pasture green going gold in the October light, the cattle moving slow in the distance, the buildings of the main property visible to the southwest, the neighboring operation showing here and there as smokes and roof lines across the plain. She sat there for a while without moving. It was not what she'd imagined when she'd sat in her father's office reading the Voss debt summary, calculating whether the land was worth the cost of what was broken. She hadn't imagined this. She hadn't known enough yet to imagine it. She'd only known that the land was good and the debt was manageable, and the man might be able to hear things. She'd been right about all three. But she hadn't imagined the rest of it, the specific weight of the Northeast Wells pump handle on a summer morning, or the sound of Garrison's laughing at something Pete said in the main barn, or the way Colton looked at the property in the mornings, like it was something worth protecting. She hadn't imagined the ranchers sitting around Alderman's kitchen table, deciding not to disappear. She hadn't imagined what it would feel like to stand in a formal hearing room in Cheyenne and watch a land commissioner read documents she had assembled and understand, from the quality of his attention, that he was finding them credible. She hadn't imagined any of the specific texture of it, because you can't imagine the texture of something you haven't lived yet. You can only do the work and let the texture accumulate. The morning light moved across the valley the way morning light does in October, sideways and golden and brief, before it shifts to something more ordinary. She watched it for as long as it lasted. Then she turned her horse toward the main property and rode back to work. That's the whole of it, really. Not a legend, Eliza would have objected to the word, but a life. Built in the place where she'd arrived with nothing but a sharp mind and a refusal to be read a list of things she wasn't allowed to do. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.